Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, did I make a mistake in creating a Norse Code fantasy league in which a kicker could score over 100 points?
Cosmically, yes. But it is good content.
What did I create? This is bad. This is... I got screenshots from nearly every person in the league going, what is going on here? I should explain. So I've made reference on the show before that there's a secret league that is... It's experimental. It's purely like a sandbox of sorts, just to test out how badly we can break fantasy football. And it punishes and rewards kicking to an absurd degree. You can get 25 points for a field goal that is 50 yards or more.
So I think you get the 25 points for that field goal, but then you also, in addition, you get double counted essentially, because I think you also get a point per yard.
It's not a point per yard, but it's close.
Yeah, so something along those lines. Yeah. So Graham Gano scored 140 points in that league. So when I tweeted that, I think people assume that I'm on the other end of this. I'm not.
But Luke is, I believe.
Someone is. Might be Luke. Yeah. And boy, like Terry McLaurin had a great game, like a legitimately good game. And it doesn't matter. Graham Gano scored 140 points. This league also has safeties in it, I guess?
It does, yes.
Yeah, so cool.
This is this is about as dumb a situation as you could possibly desire. And no, actually the Mandalorian is the fellow who runs the Daily Norseman. It's Chris.
Oh my god, it's Chris?
Yeah, it's Chris.
Oh.
Fearless leader.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
He is getting crushed by a truck.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure.
That is too bad. Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys are doing well. We have a game to preview. The Vikings are playing the Cardinals this weekend, and so we are going to bring on a special guest. We will talk more about that in just a moment, but just want to thank you guys so much for listening to the show. Again, really do appreciate it. If you would like to support the show financially, you can do it in one of two different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and sign up there for all of $3.50 a month. You get a bunch of bonus material that we put out. I'll be putting out the bonus episode, I believe next week, like early next week. I'll have a bonus episode out for you guys. Probably sneak one more in before the end of the month as well. So if you're interested in such things, if you'd like to listen to some of the off-air banter or whatever, or random bits that we just begin, you can check us out over at patreon.com/NorseCode. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well if you'd like to make a one-time donation, or if you'd like to get a t-shirt, baby onesie, notebook, masks are also available. You can do so over at norsecode.threadless.com and check out the collections section and see what we've got. We will also be launching a new t-shirt as well soon, just in time for the holidays. So we will be launching something special for that here coming up soon. We just haven't finalized it yet, but that will be coming. And I feel like everyone should have something like this for the holidays. I believe you saw the design for it last year, and I'm pleased that this is something that the people will have access to.
It's a lot. Do I have access to it? We never got one for me, right? So.
No, we have not. We have not done this yet, and I have a feeling that this is.
I don't know if I want to wear it to an ugly sweater party, because it is weird to wear like with your face on it, you know?
Yeah. Well, at that point, it really just becomes a question of, are you entering a portal to another dimension by doing this? Or is this turning into more of like the portrait of Dorian Gray, in which you have this shirt up in your attic that is slowly like aging, and then but you're like managing to like maintain. So there's
Good.
we don't often get to pull Oscar Wilde quotes on this show, but because we received two links to The Guardian in the in the show notes today, I felt like classing the joint up a bit. So that's that's where we're at. So again, if you'd like to help donate to the show, Patreon, PayPal, check out the show notes. We've got information on that if you'd like. And let's get into the game itself, because we have a special guest to bring on. We've had him on several times now. We're going to do a preview that Arif taped earlier today with Blake Allen Murphy of Revenge of the Birds and the Revenge of the Birds podcast, and we'll be going to that right now.
Right, I'm here with Blake Murphy. Your Twitter ad is Blake Allen Murphy. I don't know if I should also include that whenever I say your name, but writer for Revenge of the Birds, host of their podcast, whose name I just forgot, so let me know that too. What's going on, man?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's the ROTB pod, or just the Revenge of the Birds podcast is the name. A lot of the Revenge of the Birds can get repetitive. So yeah, it's good to be on, at least for all of that. Good to talk about a upcoming Cardinals-Vikings game, which first game I'll be in attendance for in almost 2 years. So I'm pretty excited for that.
Oh, dope. Before we get started talking about the team, one of I think the kind of cooler things about interviewing someone like you is that you actually have professional or semi-professional, however you want to call it, experience in our front office. Is that right?
Yeah, we worked at least for a time for the Arizona Rattlers. This is kind of where they bring in a lot of people, develop them as far as for scouting interns and other places, and then we'll kind of send them off into the industry. I learned through a lot of that I felt like that I had football as a passion, and looking at it into as a career, you almost felt like you didn't get to enjoy it as much. So I preferred stuff on the media side. It's also a little bit of a sore point since I follow the Rattlers each year, and they just lost, I think, their fourth straight at home as far as like it's a different area for the arena football now. It's now, I think, the indoor football league, but it's like every single year they seem to get that as a home game, and then they just seem to lose it, and they only win when it's away. So we haven't seen a home championship for the Rattlers for some time.
Well, was their last championship when you were on staff?
They actually won another one. They'd won the Pro Indoor Football League in between then, but that was like the last one as far as they'd won one more after me. But I was the last part of a three-peat, and that was also, I believe, like their last year in what the Arena Football League as we know it was. They just had a lot of, with the NFL taking on a bigger approach and a lot of things, COVID was kind of the death knell for the AFL in some different ways, but they had at least managed to pull out a little bit earlier and did some solid investments. And it's still an important part, I think, of the football community. You'll still see some guys who pop up out of that place that end up kind of, being able to kind of make a roster in the NFL or be able to have a bit of an impact. Or sometimes it's even just kind of slip through the cracks because of the size of the school that they went to, didn't catch on as much in a training camp, and are able to develop into a pro. And that's kind of where some of the scouting background I had came from. And some of it was being able to just experience being a part of a team that was making a championship run, which of course they won in Cleveland because they didn't win it back in Arizona. Can't win it in front of the home crowd. So
that's funny. The Vikings have over time signed a number of Arena Football League guys, including a former Arizona Rattler, I think an edge rusher. I forget his name now.
True. I believe that was Mackey. I think it was Mackey at least.
Yeah, Leon Mackey.
That was it. Yeah, I remember. I think I gave like a scouting report on some of that, which was fun at least. And it's like, you see a player and who they are, and you get to recognize when you're at the arena level exactly what a guy's ceiling is, because, if they had the proper arm length, they probably wouldn't have, been a center in the AFL because they got such short arms. And some of those guys that got one pass rushing move, and so as soon as you know how to shut that down, they're done. But hey, they got long arms and they know how to be able to get after it, and that's some of that is just important for guys who just continue to love playing and love being a part of the sport of professional football.
Dope. Well, yeah, let's talk more about professional football. Let's talk a little bit about the Arizona Cardinals. Fantastic win against the Tennessee Titans. Already forgot the score. Man, I have forgotten so much already at the beginning of this podcast, or at least I'm admitting that I forgot a lot of it. But yeah, just crushed the Titans early on. One of the more interesting stats, and we'll get into the player-by-player stuff, one of the more interesting stats is that Kyler Murray had, I think, held onto the ball longer than all but 2-3 other quarterbacks in the NFL in week one. But also had one of the lower pressure rates in the NFL in week 1, which is just pretty rare. You never really see that. It's usually 1-to-1. But yeah, just really phenomenal basketball stuff. The throw to Rondale Moore, I think, where he, buries Sanders across the field. Amazing. But kind of big picture, not to get caught up in the trees. Let's look at the forest. What was the reason that they were able to do everything against the Titans?
Yeah, I think a lot of it ultimately starts up front with the fact that the Tennessee Titans came out and said, hey, here's how we're going to attack. We're going to run the ball with Derrick Henry, and then we're going to be able to kind of, do your typical, maybe sometimes bootlegs or fakes, at least for the most part. What ended up happening, unfortunately, was they decided to leave Chandler Jones in a contract year one-on-one with Taylor Lewan, and it did not turn out well for Taylor Lewan. It also didn't turn out well for Ryan Tannehill, as Jones had 3 sacks in the first quarter alone, and the Titans just never really seemed to adjust. I think maybe having J.J. Watt, who they had seen over a number of years on the other side of the field, may have spooked them, and for whatever reason, Arizona seemed to game plan well on the defensive side. That didn't really matter what Tennessee tried. It just did not seem to work. And that's really what set up the Cardinals into solid placement. They had a big opening pass, I believe, to DeAndre Hopkins, and then struggled to get into the end zone. Finally kind of do after a crazy touchdown, I believe, from Kyler Murray. But essentially it was the Cardinals defense, which a lot of people had questions about, especially the secondary. There's some older players. What does it look like with the 2 young linebackers and Isaiah Simmons and Zaven Collins, getting major snaps for the first time in their respective careers. And by all accounts, Arizona's defense passed the test with flying colors that allowed the offense to kind of be able to take it easy for the most part and be able to still see some production and drive down the field. But it never felt like they had to press or really felt like the game was out of Arizona's control at all. And it really starts up front in that regard with some of the improvement we saw from their defense from 2020.
Yeah, it was bad enough that Taylor Lewan went to Twitter and thanked Chandler Jones for exposing him. I don't think I've ever seen that in my life. So really, really interesting stuff. I mean, that's just kind of how bad things went. We'll talk about the defensive line, offensive line matchup in a second. But as usual, we'll start with the offense. So Kyler Murray, obviously kind of the star, or I guess the most interesting story, I should say, of this group. What about Murray gives you kind of confidence that he'll be able to sustain a high level of play? Maybe not the level of play against Tennessee, but a high level of play given what seemed like a drop-off in the back half of last season.
Yeah, I think the drop-off, a lot of people link to injuries, but the biggest thing you can almost say is, as far as Kyler goes, is he's one of those guys who, you have a play where he just bails the pocket slightly early, or maybe there's a little bit of extra pressure, starts running to the sideline. All right, it's time to throw it away out of bounds or something, or, just if you throw it back across your body, it's going to be rough. And then somehow he manages to make this insane throw and catch 2 DeAndre Hopkins. You're like, oh, all right, well, you can go ahead and do that then as well. So I think that some of the high end that we see of Kyler and just the physical talent, it's really rare to find guys who are his size and stature that have probably a top 5, top 7 arm in the league, who also have the ability to scamper around like they're Lamar Jackson and just, make guys look silly or put them on skates. I think the confidence in a lot of ways is maybe for a lot of Cardinals fans, and myself included, is maybe even less in Kyler himself, but maybe a bit more in having a former, I think it was second team All-Pro, Pro Bowl center in front of him. The Cardinals previously had a journeyman in A.Q. Shipley in front. And then last year, I believe it's actually now Viking, I believe, is a guard in Mason Cole. So that's a guy who's not even on their team, was traded for a 6th-round pick, but not even playing the same position. So there was a lot of issues that Arizona had last year. And so it's something to see him actually have a little bit of a pocket to step up in. He was only sacked 1 time yesterday, and even though the ball was held onto for a little longer, there's been some improvement he's made mentally as well. Last year, if you wanted to beat the Cardinals offense, the easiest way that you could do that, essentially, before Kyler ended up taking the injury that seemed to hamper him and they didn't run him as much, was to just blitz him, because they didn't seem to really have some of this pre-snap recognition. And post-snap, you're having Cliff Kingsbury running this air raid, 5 wide, only 5 offensive linemen, no tight end blocking personnel. If a team blitzes, he gets 5 or 6 guys, either one guy gets past his man, suddenly Murray's under pressure, and he would just hold on to the ball long enough that there wasn't as much of a plan. This year, one of their touchdown passes, Rodney Hudson helped actually identify that it was zero. I think it was a cover zero being run, and actually they had a quick slant to DeAndre Hopkins. They were able to hit, and then he ran that in for a touchdown. And likewise, there was another touchdown pass to Christian Kirk that Murray had as well. And I think some of that is part of the natural growth of your quarterback that's expected in year 3. And some of it is also the fact that people forget the Cardinals in 2018 were like legitimately one of the bottom 3 offenses in the NFL of the last decade. So just building back a lot of the talent that they had on offense, in addition to, putting everything on this number 1 pick, I think that it's just taken some time. And I think that it's still a work in progress. But that's been part of where I think some of the confidence that has come from is just when you watch the guy play, you're like, okay, like, I don't know if there's an it factor as a quarterback. I don't know if there's like some sort of, magic formula, but if whatever there is, this guy at least has that ability to be able to go and lead the team. And I guess at this point, a lot of the questions may circle around whether that's sustainable with his health and whether that's going to be something that's a case of what doesn't seem to be a good Tennessee defense that Cliff Kingsbury is able to go against, and the tougher defenses may lead to more of a challenge.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting matchup. We'll talk about that right after I think we finish up some of the positional stuff on the offense, because I do have some questions with the offensive line and the protections that you pointed out as being kind of a big part of their ability to kind of adapt to changing circumstances and blitzes. Real quick on the quarterback front, former Gopher Chris Streveler is on a roster, which, good for him. What's the deal? Do you know anything about him?
Oh yeah, no, Chris Streveler. Yeah, this is the nickname Streveler the Leveler is kind of what went on from I believe.
Yeah, that makes sense. That fits.
Yeah, it was from the Canadian Football League, where essentially him using his rushing ability was able to kind of lead, I believe, is the Winnipeg Bombers to a CFL title. He gets signed by the Cardinals and ends up actually legitimately beating out Brett Hundley for the backup job. That was one of the surprises that I think a lot of people had saw last year. It's like, oh, you're keeping Chris Streveler. Okay, this is your, Taysom Hill type role. They did utilize him to pick up a first down, like a 4th and 1 previously. You're like, okay, that seems to make sense. And then to kind of have him in that full-time backup role as we saw against the Los Angeles Rams last year, he kind of comes in for a Kyler Murray injury and ends up struggling for the most part just to move the ball down the field. Arizona brings back Murray, but at that point in the 4th quarter, he even said by the time, a certain something had time to set in. This is kind of like, NFL players and pain management type of thing, which I got to see a little bit of firsthand in the Arena League, is that's a factual thing that players go through as far as what they do to their bodies in order to be able to play. It's just crazy to think about. He's been kind of constantly more trying to develop as a passer. I think he's in that regard right now of, he might end up catching on as a backup at some point for someone else, but the team went out and manually signed Colt McCoy because they needed someone who, even though they didn't have the legs or athleticism of Streveler, they wanted someone who is probably going to be able to fit Cliff Kingsbury's Big 12 style of football. And who better to do that than a former Texas quarterback, apparently.
Yeah, I guess that follows. Let's talk a little bit about another former Gopher, Max Williams, and the rest of that tight end group. So Max Williams, 2nd-round pick for Baltimore, was really incredible in college, has not really lived up to that in the NFL. And, what place more fitting for that than a team that doesn't even use tight ends?
Absolutely, yeah. That's been one of the bigger, I think, complaints Cardinals fans have had is that you occasionally will see these seam routes to Williams that will happen. He just isn't quite the athlete to be able to be consistent. He's, got solid hands, but I think it was in his career, I think someone had projected his stats this year of catching, I think it was like 293 yards. I'm like, wow, that would basically be like a career year for him, catching more than 250 yards. He's a guy who they really did miss last year as he got hurt, and it was his ability as a blocker that really was something that helped keep the team from kind of going under in 2019. They went from more of that 10 personnel, all wide receiver look that just saw teams just constantly blitz and had issues to much more of this 11 and 12 personnel power run game. And Max Williams played a integral part of that. It's just part of where the NFL as a modern game now is it's a matchup and mismatch game. And that's been one of the questions with Cliff Kingsbury and with the other teams, is that teams have been adjusting to finding these mismatches of these hyper athletic tight ends who, they're too fast for a linebacker and then too big for a safety. Kind of the same thing as far as when it comes to pass catching running backs. The days of Leonard Fournette as a top 5 pick are kind of out the window. But they did miss Max last year in that regard. They just, like you said, they don't really focus as much on matchups as the Cardinals would probably like to. If they do find some of them, it'll be much more in maybe some of the play calls or arenas. But to start, you kind of pick two of the weaker areas, I think, of the Arizona Cardinals overall, areas that doesn't really put fright into an NFL defense, much less, if you trotted out the Cardinals tight ends against Alabama's defense. I'm pretty sure at least you could take some of those guys who would be, like future, future car dealers, future insurance salesmen, because not everyone's going to go on to great things from Bama, but they would probably be one of those players like, oh yeah, okay, that's some great tape you're able to kind of put up again and coverage on that tight end. So
we'll go from a position of weakness to a position of uncertainty. Let's talk about running back a little bit. I don't know what to make of the Cardinals running back room. I was on a podcast earlier this week, and they asked me about whether or not the Cardinals running backs will be able to give them as much trouble as Joe Mixon did. And I had completely forgotten about Chase Edmonds James Conner. I remembered Chase Edmonds, remembered, Benjamin, who I don't even think was active last week against the Titans. What is your approach to this running back group? Is this really just a team that has kind of embraced that you can kind of produce from the running back position with the right schematic approach? And if that's the case, why would they have invested any money in James Conner at all? If not, how do you feel the talent of that running back group has kind of shown up?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with Arizona, and this is kind of something that we've seen over the years, is that as long as Cliff Kingsbury and Kyler Murray are there because of the rushing threat that Kyler is and because of some of the uniqueness of the play calls, they're going to at least have productive running backs. Now, as far as what that means for fantasy football, I was kind of warning some people at least earlier that the upside that a lot of people were hoping to project for Chase Edmonds was probably not close to what it would be. Chase is the kind of the comparison I would give as far as the style of play is it's kind of like a little bit of if you took a lesser version of like your LeSean McCoy and maybe a greater version of, and this is kind of like a throwback name at least for that one, but it's going to kind of this is like this tiny scat back at least that got a lot of carries at least. I'll have to remember it in a little bit at least. This is like, 5'7" type of a small back at least for that one.
They could have Darren Sproles?
Yeah, like a Sproles type. So kind of in the between the two of them where you've got this incredible kind of change of direction. He was like one of the, I think Fordham, a small school at least, he still put up like incredible 3-cone numbers as far as change of direction. You watch him like last year against the Seattle Seahawks and he's able to just, scamper on a dime, get outside and hit the corner and be able to pick up, 10 or 12 yards. And yet he's just not a guy who really is consistent in between the tackles. So they'll utilize him and his receiving skills, but they won't really take him as far as this, brute mauler, because he's just 5'9", 200. When he did get a lot of carries, we saw that twice. Both of them were like I think it was a New York game, and then it wasn't against the Bills, but I think it was another, the Giants or another time where he got a heavy workload. And both times he got hurt and had to kind of sit out for the next couple of games or so. And I think that's one of the spots where you can at least say that it might not be that the team's running backs are at least as high quality, and it might not be that the team's, rushing ability is, going to be dynamic if Kyler Murray isn't back there. But we're able to at least see that they're able to be productive even in this kind of role and running back by committee type of approach. Like Chase Edmonds, most people don't realize, but he had 100 total yards last week. He had 63 yards on 12 rushes. So that's like about almost 5.5 yards per attempt. And he had 4 catches for 43 yards. So you're like, okay, this is a guy who they're keeping him in his best role, which is you try to get these design runs that can pick up for large gains, whether it's getting him in space versus just kind of running him into the tackle box. And then you put him in as a receiver, allow him to make a guy miss and be able to kind of pick up a number of yards or, maybe develop a screen with a few blockers and he can pick up, maybe about 8 to 12 yards or so. That's when the James Conner comes in as far as being the guy who's more of their closer, and they saw him as a bigger back of being the kind of player who you can give a lot of carries to for the most part. And even though he's been, not super effective, I think he'd only less than 3.5 yards per attempt. He still touched the ball like 16 times. So he legitimately out-touched Chase Edmonds as far as when it came to about the number of rushes that was there, but he got utilized up the middle and late in the game when you're watching, they were trying to run out the clock. They were able to get a good enough push behind him. He was physical with the stiff arm. So it's kind of one of those weird mixes of, you don't quite have like the thunder and lightning of like a Derrick Henry and what was it? Not Deion Sims at least, but there was
Deion Lewis.
Lewis, yeah, it's not the thunder and lightning that those guys were kind of intended to be, but you're kind of like your mini thunder and mini lightning, and then you talk about mini lightning and Kyler Murray, who's able to like outrun guys, and suddenly you're just like, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. Last week, I believe they had a play that Arizona designed that showcased like how their rushing attack is so different from most of the NFL, where they essentially ran a Kyle Shanahan play, except instead of it being like an end around to a wide receiver or to like a running back who'd been in the slot, they said Kyler Murray tucked the ball and run behind two blockers, and he picked up a first down, ran out of bounds, wasn't touched. And you're like, oh yeah, like that's okay. That's what happens when you got a guy who can run, like a low 4.3 as your quarterback that just for whatever reason can just seem to just accelerate that quickly. And you put some blockers behind him. You're like, okay, this is just like what everyone wanted to see with who is, I think, Michael Vick and Madden. Like that's essentially what Kyler Murray has been as far as the backfield goes, where you're seeing this kind of chess piece that you can move around in a lot of ways. It kind of helps a lot of the other chess pieces as well, even if they may not be, names that strike fear into the heart of an NFL defensive coordinator and Edmonds and Connor.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I was thinking kind of one of the challenges the Vikings will have is in dealing with the possibility of a Kyler Murray run. I don't really mean a scramble. That's going to be its own independent challenge. But in terms of his ability to kind of hold defenders in the run game by being a running threat himself is going to do a lot more for Chase Edmonds and James Conner than Chase Edmonds and James Conner will do for themselves, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Now I think we get to probably the strength of the group, especially if it seems like Christian Kirk has become a good receiver. But this receiver group is pretty fun. It's pretty interesting. It's one of those areas where you kind of don't know where they fit into this conversation about having some of the best receiving groups in the league, right? Because you take a look, obviously, at Tampa Bay, and you see that receiving group. You take a look at some of the duos around the league, like Seattle, of course, in division. You take a look at Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp in division. You take a look at the Vikings with Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, or the trio that they have in Buffalo. And you don't really know kind of where to put some of these people because Christian Kirk, I feel like, hasn't really kind of made a stamp on the NFL. Rondale Moore is a rookie. AJ Green is kind of on his last legs, and you've got DeAndre Hopkins. He's got a pretty good argument to be the best receiver in the NFL, and if he's not, he's probably top 3. So what about this receiving group kind of stands out to you? Because I see DeAndre Hopkins, AJ Green, and an enormous amount of speed.
Yeah, that's really kind of in a lot of cases what it is. And some of that is just due to Cliff Kingsbury's style. Like he's not a guy who, on occasion he'll move some of the players down into the slot, but it's more of like he'll do that as much as he will, put Kyler under center, where then Kyler seems to just disappear behind Rodney Hudson for the most part, at least just because of that height. So with the likes of Hopkins, you're kind of seeing where last year he was targeted. I think it was like almost like a ridiculous, I think it was like either 23 or I feel like it was closer to 29% of their passing targets like went to him, which is just like, it's an insane amount. Not only I think of like how good he is, how utilized he was. He went and had like a 1,400 yard season, but it also just demonstrated like how the Cardinals' weakness in a lot of cases was really tied to not being able to find some of those matchups. They were just predominantly a left side offense that, would on occasion take shots to Christian Kirk on the other side. And then you have your occasional, like 7 to 8 yard pass to Larry Fitzgerald, and the rest was all just this horizontal passing game. So this year, as far as the passes it was a lot more evenly divided, where you still see Hopkins got his, I think it was like 8 targets or so, at least. I think it was at 6 catches for 8 targets, if I remember correctly, where he still got kind of the bulk of the shots, but by adding AJ Green on the outside and also by being able to put the speed threat of Rondale Moore in the slot, when the Cardinals spread out, they at least give defenses a lot of trouble because, if you're going to decide, hey, we're going to double DeAndre Hopkins on this side, at least for that, take away that ball. AJ Green has some size. Now we'll get back to Green in a second, at least, but a lot of what it's really done is kind of taken Christian Kirk and matched him up in the slot where he's a lot more comfortable. And that's kind of why when you see his 2 touchdowns the other day, like one of those, I believe, was on a safety in Kevin Byard, since Cardinals came up to the line, ran the ball right up the middle, and then Titans, running their defense because of how quick it was. Sometimes it's easier, harder to adjust. They get up to the line quick. It's part of the kind of Cliff's philosophy, which in some cases, I think some have talked about that there's a fault or two with that philosophy. You can get to that in a bit, but it allowed Kirk to kind of match up on the third cornerback for the most part. And then you talk about Rondale Moore being a guy who running in the low 4.3s can also, he's also an incredibly balanced guy. He's only 5'7", but when you talk about a guy who can essentially just like break tackles like that, plays the game like a running back, you suddenly set up a screen pass for him. And if you're trying to blitz the Cardinals, suddenly, blitzing is just, hey, I'm the greatest pass rusher of all time. And then you realize that they just swung the ball out to Rondale Moore and he's like 10 yards downfield with a lead blocker leading the way. And that's kind of where the Cardinals, they have not had the personnel to do that, because the player that they got to throw those balls to last year was 37-year-old Larry Fitzgerald, who, if we're going to be perfectly honest, he like had his worst career output. He had 300 or so total yards. Obviously, there was some issues with COVID and it being a unique year, but he is not one of those guys that you say, oh, yeah, talk about explosive playmakers, at least, who can catch horizontal balls out of the backfield. Not a single person is going to mention Fitzgerald. So some of that has been personnel-wise, age. They've kind of gone to something that fits a lot better. And I think it's benefited a lot more in that regard, as it's kind of been turned into a pick your poison, because, hey, let's say a defense is we're going to go ahead, we're going to rush 4 people, at least for that one. We're going to drop 7. We'll make sure we can cover all 4 of these guys, plus the running back out of the backfield. Kyler may just look ahead and say, oh, hey, look, nobody's got me, and then take off, to be able to pick up a first down. And that's where I think that there's maybe not elite weapons, you could say. Like, I don't think that any of the Cardinals players outside of Hopkins could compare to, maybe the trio that you'd have with, or I guess the duo of having a Tyreek and having a Kelsey. I would even say the Cardinals receivers, like, you could make an argument that the Chiefs pair of receivers for the most part would beat the Cardinals quad of receivers. But being able to add in that all-in-all threat that you have from Murray to be able to either scramble and buy time or to run, it does make the Cardinals a very multi-dimensional offense that, it's like a Swiss Army knife. It's not going to be this giant Bowie knife, but boy, if there's a lot of little knives they can use to cut you.
Well, let's talk about some of these questions surrounding the receivers. So Christian Kirk is entering his 4th year. He hasn't ever broken 1,000 yards, or he hasn't even broken 750 yards in his career. His yards per touch has always been kind of low, but he has been used as a little bit of a rushing threat on occasion. But it seems like he's been used, especially prior to Kingsbury, but just generally, as an underneath slot guy with fairly limited upside despite kind of his athletic profile. Now, obviously, he's coming off of a 2-touchdown game. He had 70 yards, fairly high yards per reception, at least for him. That 70 yards is about 1.7 times his career yards per game. Is he good?
Oh, man, is Christian Kirk good is probably going to be like one of the questions that fantasy experts have been asking for years, because, you'll go and you'll see him in 2020, at least with the Cardinals, have like an insane game against the Miami Dolphins. And then you'll watch it and everyone's like, oh, man, Kirk's finally becoming a star. And then he'll have like 2 catches over like the next 2 games and maybe 1 touchdown. And it's been one of the areas as far as consistency where the kind of receiver I think that Kirk is in a lot of ways is he's kind of he would be a really great wide receiver 3 for a team. I think it's maybe slightly below average wide receiver 2, where the impact that I think he's going to have this year, maybe he does fully blossom into that wide receiver 2 role. Because previously he was drafted by the Cardinals in 2018, and they kind of saw him as a guy who could play inside or outside. And everyone else is like, well, all right, well, good luck with that. This is a guy who should be a pure slot receiver, making a living in the intermediate, maybe a couple of these bubble screens that you're able to draw up for him. And he ended up spending like the first 3 years of his career on the outside because the team had, 37 Larry Fitzgerald lined up in the slot for them. So there was very few times that we got to see Kirk truly operate out of the slot and be able to kind of be that type of receiver who could get those type of matchups. I think it's one of the cases of like, if Christian Kirk is good, I think the case is, I think that he's good, but I don't know for sure if he's going to be as good as what someone may be willing to pay for him, or even the Cardinals if they decide to extend him after this year. Because I think that as far as the traits and where he wins, you could say, all right, he wins on these deep routes, but he's more of a 4-4 guy. So it's not like he's this elite burner, but he can still have an 80-yard touchdown like he did against, I think the Cowboys last year, if I remember on Monday, it was Monday Night Football, and he had another one against the Dolphins. but then he'll just kind of disappear for a game or time at 2. So when you ask if he's good, I think some of that may come down to a combination of usage and skill, some of the matchups that are there, and maybe we get to see him finally have one of these competent seasons now that he's operating out of the slot full time, and AJ Green is taking the cornerback that he would be on the other outside because of the way that Cliff Kingsbury sets up his offense. He loves having big, tall guys who can kind of go up and make plays on the outside, and he loves having these small, speedy guys that are inside the slot in the middle, and that's kind of a place where he doesn't really use those mismatches to kind of dictate things to the defense so much as just kind of use some of those things that are more likely to work, such as, hey, all right, we're going to have try to see if we can get them line up at least for the most part with these quick no-huddle offense, and suddenly you got a linebacker and a tight end. They switch routes, and suddenly you're like, oh boy, hey, we got a linebacker covering Rondale Moore. This isn't going to work. And that's kind of some of his approach, at least. And to his credit, we've seen the Cardinals be boosted on offense, and to kind of some of their detriment, a lot of people do wonder if, he's either holding some of the team back by not leaning more into kind of a diverse set and being able to scheme guys open in some of that regard with matchups, or if, a team comes out that throws a few kind of crazy things at them, is he really going to be able to adjust on the fly? And I think that's one of the cases that comes down to with Kirk is, I think in a lot of different cases, it's almost he's one of those players of he can kind of be whatever you want him to be because he's shown all of the good and the bad on the football field kind of all at once over these last 3 years. And he's heading into an important contract year. And right now, the only thing we can talk about, I think, as Cardinals fans is after week 1, hey, cool. Glad we have AJ Green outside to make 2 catches for 25 yards because it meant Kirk was able to go off.
A lot of second-round picks in these receivers. Have any of? I mean, we don't know yet for Rondale Moore, but I guess technically, with DeAndre Hopkins went for a second, right? That's
they've spent a second, or I think it was a day 2 pick every single year since 2015. I believe they spent a day 2 pick on a wide receiver. I think it went except for 2016 they did not, but it was 2017 until 2021. So it's like 4 straight years of spending second-round picks on wide receivers. And one of those, at least in Hopkins, you're like, okay, that worked. He was formerly a first-round pick, but the only one who seems like he's gotten quite a bit of hype is Rondale Moore. And it's not too often that you see a guy who's wide receiver 4, they talk about in the draft call of going, hey, we're going to have you back on kick and punt returns, maybe work you in some. And then you suddenly just see their plan for him change drastically as he just kind of makes play after play in the preseason, showcasing a little bit of the, not just the speed mismatch, but just a much more nuanced ability to use in Cliff Kingsbury's offense. Like, he did get an end zone target on a deeper pass against the Titans and had, I think it was 4 catches for, I want to say it was 46 yards. It was a case of when you're talking about a wide receiver 4, it's really weird that you'd target a wide receiver 4 not only that much, but to be able to utilize him as far as they did. And then, there's obviously some special teams usage, but he currently leads the NFL in 16 yards after the catch as far as for that. And that's really where he makes his living, is just being able to have that explosiveness, breaking tackles. And that's one of the cases, at least, where as I think they work him in, it's one of the spots of where he just had the, a lot of the different things that we saw of breaking out early as a freshman, being able to kind of just kind of be kind of in a lot of ways the best player on the Boilermakers field, the 200-yard game against Ohio State. He's gotten Anquan Boldin comparisons from their Cardinals GM. I think that's a little bit shy of where it is, because
just in terms of impact that he could have.
Well, I think it's impact, but also the idea of toughness. A good way to describe that is rookie Anquan Boldin was a huge impact for that. Fair. But also the toughness factor of more of this is a guy who's 5'7", but plays like a running back. And part of the reason why they really saw this toughness is if you got you could have Derwin James running at him and he still is going to play like he can run through Derwin James, which that's the same type of toughness that Boldin had, where you kind of had maybe the sleekness of Fitzgerald, who had to become a physical guy later in his career. Boldin was always that guy who would, go out for 100 yards, and half of those would be after the catch, he would take a hit to, the teeth that would break his jaw, and he'd be like, all right, put a couple plates in, I'll be good to go next week. And I think that sort of toughness is something that the Cardinals really appreciate when it's come to being able to find that. And, in some of those cases, I think Kyler Murray also appreciates actually having a guy that can look up to him now, because, he's 5'9" and Moore's only 5'7". So you got a little guy, you got 2 little guys at least that are making plays out there for the Cardinals.
That's pretty funny. Would you take, in a matchup, would you take 2021 AJ Green or 2020 Patrick Peterson?
Ooh, that's a good one because I think that's one of those weird cases where it's almost kind of like not necessarily say a wash for that one, but it's like a lot of what AJ Green has done as far as in the Cardinals camp was impressive. Some of that I think is, you go from having Christian Kirk as an outside receiver or having, was it Damiere Byrd or all these other journeymen to a guy who actually can run more than just like a fly route down the field or a comeback route. So I think that as far as it goes for this year, it really depends because what we saw with Peterson as far as with his ability and his in 2020 was just he was having a difficult time keeping up with, some of the bigger, speedier receivers. For that one, he gave a lot of cushion. And some of it was he, at the very end, did become like some of a struggle in run support. But he still was able to make, enough plays for the most part throughout the year that, it wasn't like this guy is completely washed. That's kind of, I think, the same description you could almost give to AJ Green. Like, he had 6 targets against the Titans. One of those, it's like it was the easiest ball he'd catch all day. He had a ton of I think he was playing off coverage on him, giving him some space. And he just steps out of bounds like a rookie would. And so you're like wondering how much there is still left. Did he just make kind of that mistake? He had 2 catches for 25 yards. One of them was like a solid catch, I think, on either 3rd down or 2nd and long that moved the chains. But it does feel like that kind of is a matchup. The harder matchup, I think, at least, is, if you get DeAndre Hopkins on Patrick Peterson and you flip over to having a Bashaud Breeland against AJ Green, that's one of those spots where I think it becomes an advantage for Arizona because I think that either of those players, I think, are probably, Hopkins' case, it's obviously different because, it's DeAndre Hopkins. Like, this is a guy who, you could have, me throwing the ball to him and he'd still probably have 1,000-yard season at least. But I think AJ Green is still maybe a step ahead of what we've seen for the most part. It'll just really depend a lot on, does the game plan that they have against that call for a lot of these throws outside, is he going to be able to have, some of that same vertical speed? He did show, at least in some areas, like that he still has some of the vertical speed to make a catch kind of in that cover 2 hole where, you throw the ball, he's a step ahead of the corner, the safety's coming over. They hit him on time. I think he still has some of the speed for that, but I think that would be a really curious matchup because this would be one of those cases of, if you watch the 2010 college football season, Patrick Peterson versus AJ Green was like a highlight of the season. You watch it now and it might just be like, all right, there's it's nice to see these guys are getting some, extra, $1 million in their, after their heydays are long gone for the most part, at least. You're just like, it's kind of I think someone called it the name bowl or something like that, is the Patrick Peterson versus AJ Green. He got the 4th overall pick, the 5th overall pick, and it wouldn't shock anyone if you walk away from the game and they're like, it wasn't a lot of fireworks there, maybe a sparkler or two, but not a lot of fireworks.
Yeah, definitely rec league full vibes there. All right, so DeAndre Hopkins, before we move on to the offensive line, DeAndre Hopkins is clearly kind of the headliner offensively for the Arizona Cardinals. What makes him so good? Because there's so many contested catch specialists entering the NFL that you don't always see them 100% open. And they don't kind of work out. Like Jalen Strong, great example. They just don't work out when they enter the NFL. That is kind of the vibe that people get about DeAndre Hopkins, that he's a contested catch specialist. Why is he a top-tier receiver while all these other guys couldn't figure it out?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes down to the mental preparation in the game, and you can see that kind of dedication to their craft. What's really funny about, if you had to compare, talking about contested catch specialists, some of those amazing grabs, not just, the 10-inch hands that he has to get, I think it's 5XL or something like that gloves. That's, I think, one big reason is if your goal is to catch the football, having large hands and having good hands and concentration would seem to help with that exceedingly. But the comparison in a lot of ways that's interesting of adding the likes of Hopkins is it's probably the closest possible replacement you could have had to Larry Fitzgerald that would have been like Larry Fitzgerald. As far as, a lot of people saw Fitz as this kind of circus catch freak that you'd just go up and be able to get the ball and come down with it in double coverage. A lot of people see that with Hopkins. But really, I think a lot of it is there's the study, the preparation, and then just having this sort of awareness on the field in the middle of the action. Or you'll have the Cardinals were able to design a couple of plays last year that, kind of tricked the defense and got him a little bit of separation over the top. But then there's plays that you see where he just kind of has will either have either a signal or you can see the studying he does on film where essentially he'll just be able to locate the soft spot in the zone. He'll be wide open. He'll be able to utilize his steps where, a lot of times I think last year the Cardinals ran a ton of just comeback and out routes. Just, hey, it's 3rd and 7, got to have it type of down. We're going to throw the ball to D-Hop, and he would set up the cornerback, at least with the subtlety of movement, and then just break onto the out route, and the ball would just be, boom, there from Murray right as he goes out of bounds, and he would have that. And I think that's one of the cases that separates him from a lot of other people is not just having that awareness and the smarts, some of his plays as far as people wondering, how is it that a guy who couldn't even run a 4.40 is able to get all of these yards after the catch? And while there's maybe some of that toughness and tenacity, there's also the area of he's running on the field and he'll basically bait the corner into flipping their hips. And then he'll just be running down and then suddenly he'll just cut back the other way up there. And then suddenly you realize, oh, wow, he just picked up an extra 7 yards just by setting up like he was going to run to the outside corner, starts to turn his back, and he immediately would pivot back to the interior and be able to pick up a few extra yards. So I think it does show that while football is a game of inches and it can be a game of big plays, it still comes down to the best of the best are going to be guys who don't have maybe the outstanding skills, at least that you would have of the Megatrons or a Calvin Johnson or a DK Metcalf, but you would have some of these little subtleties at least that can end up making a huge difference. And I think some of that does go into, not just the on-field smarts, but the preparation that you're able to make at least. And one of those plays we saw Hopkins essentially, they had a blitz package the Titans were doing. They relay it back to Kyler Murray, knows it's a blitz coming. They just hit the ball quickly on a slant, and instead of it taking him right into the path of the corner trying to beat the guy, Hopkins just stops in a dime, spins around, and runs to the outside cone where the Titans had sucked everyone up inside. There was literally no safety on the outside who was going to be able to get close to him, and he runs to the pylon. It takes that, I think, sort of ability and recognition combined with all of the other traits that kind of puts it into why he's more of a rare receiver in today's NFL.
And then the offensive line, we've got some injury news, right? We don't know if Kelvin Beachum will be able to go.
Yeah, Beachum is day-to-day with a rib injury. It was interesting where he walked off on his own power, but did go to the locker room, was ruled out pretty immediately. Most Cardinals fans are not expecting him to play this week. Some are wondering if it's more of going to be a kind of taking time and seeing if it's going to be able to help him heal enough for a really important Rams game in week 4. Not to put down as far as where the Vikings have been, but they at least say that they have the depth. And I think coming off of a week 1 win, the goal of every NFL team, I think, is, if you can be 2-0, great. But whatever you do, don't be 0-2 because that's so hard to bounce back from if you end up starting the season 0-2. And I think that's one of the arenas where the Cardinals, they like where Justin Murray's been on the outside. They do have some depth with Brian Winters, who they signed in the offseason, who was expected to be their starting guard. He got beat out by Josh Jones in training camp, the 3rd-round pick from a year ago, who a lot of people liked as a top 30 talent. He's kind of blossomed into a guy who can play both inside and outside, and that flexibility has allowed them to put back Justin Murray, who was in 2019, they went from, I think it was having I don't know. They would have been running me out of the stands to play right tackle in 2019 under Cliff with how bad the offensive line had been. They get him off of waivers after he's released from the Browns, and we're just thrilled because he was able to kind of immediately come in and help bolster their line as a solid swing tackle. And I think that's going to be an interesting matchup because, really it's in a lot of ways it comes down to who's going to win as far as the defensive line against the offensive line. Because if you want to say it, the game is won or lost in the trenches, you can talk about how you mentioned, hey, this is a Cardinals team that got 5 sacks and 2 forced fumbles. Both of them are lost to Ryan Tannehill. And on the offensive side of the ball, Kyler Murray held onto the ball second longest of any athlete or at the quarterback position in the league, and he only took 1 sack. And I think that's going to be a matchup that we'll have to watch with the Cardinals and Vikings because right now the biggest concern, I think, at least for the Vikings would be that, you wonder if Arizona's corners can hold up against the wide receivers. And I think it's the same question you look at on the offensive side of, Arizona's probably got a wide receiver over corner advantage. And I think that they definitely may have a defensive line over the offensive line advantage when it comes to this matchup.
Well, when you take a look at some of those individual matchups, so if you end up with, Brian Winters or Josh Jones or Justin Murray at right tackle, they're up against Danielle Hunter most of the time, right? DJ Humphries will go up against, DJ Wanham, Everson Griffin, Stephen Weatherly, however that rotation shakes out. And Danielle Hunter's moved around. He played a lot on the left tackle side last week, and has been doing it in camp. But you take a look at that matchup. You see Danielle Hunter. You see maybe one of the rare athletes in the NFL that, at least in short bursts, might be able to run down Murray. How do you? Do you feel comfortable about that matchup?
Yeah, I think it's one of those spots where it'll be something to watch because, like you said, it's the Titans, for all the love Harold Landry can get from some of the people in draft Twitter, he just really has not been able to kind of fully develop as an edge presence. Part of what Cliff, I know, tries to do when there is a huge edge presence is, try to hit people with the quick screen game so that if the pass rushers get too far upfield, suddenly you're kind of abandoning some of that middle of the field territory. And then there's other avenues, at least we've seen, of teams where, a lot of times what the Cardinals would do is they get into those type of packages and then they would just simply be able to kind of push, like someone like a Hunter, even last year, I think we saw it twice with Nick Bosa, kind of push him upfield and Murray would just kind of scamper out the back door. And then utilizing a few of those throws to make, or a few of those designed runs, I think, to make the team respect it. I think that's one of the cases that we're going to end up having to see is because Chandler Jones showed one player can truly impact and make a huge difference in the game. I do think that there's been enough times we've seen Cliff Kingsbury adjust. I think the bigger question for me is not necessarily even Danielle Hunter, but is Mike Zimmer going to be able to develop kind of a downfield, if Arizona's going to try to take their 2 or 3 shots a game, can he develop enough of a downfield presence that maybe mixes up Murray a little bit where they're not quite able to read exactly all right, this is man-to-man coverage, and suddenly it backs off. It's like, okay, that was actually a cover look for the most part. Can't throw into that one-on-one matchup like I wanted to. And then suddenly by that point, then maybe your pass rusher is able to get to him. That's where I think you have to look at is I think it becomes kind of almost a not quite schematic war in some of those ways, but being able to see how, Zimmer comes in with a game plan and how the Cardinals are able to adjust, because we saw at times last year when they weren't able to have Murray's legs to bail them out, there were struggles against the New England Patriots and even the San Francisco 49ers defense that came up. The Niners didn't even have an edge rusher to the same caliber as Danielle Hunter. So I think that's one of the arenas that's going to come up is, if it ends up being the possibility where both pass rushers go off and it's a low-scoring game, maybe then some of the issue then comes up to is what does it look like for the linebacker matchup? Because, Arizona essentially went into this offseason with their first 2 picks of saying, we're going to go ahead and draft a linebacker that we know is able to be athletic enough to cover against the pass and be able to run and stop the run to kind of pair with Isaiah Simmons. And then they paired him with a kind of hefty, somewhat like a running back type of a wide receiver or slot receiver in Rondale Moore, a guy who occasionally may end up getting, a linebacker matched up onto them if a team's going to start running, a certain amount of zone coverages or has to put more of those guys on the field. So that's a mismatch I think at least maybe see on both sides. I do think that Humphreys, for the most part, is one of those guys who you really end up saying, oh yeah, this is a guy who is probably underrated at the left tackle position. I kind of agree with you there. I think you focus a lot more off the right side. Josh Jones didn't have he I think had the worst PFF grade. I think of the starters on the offensive line. Justin Murray didn't come in for too many snaps for the most part, so that may be kind of the mismatch. But then you're also looking at the other side, and I had to double check who Rashad Hill was when I looked at the depth chart for the Vikings. And I'd be like, oh yeah, it's going against Chandler Jones coming off 5 sacks in a contract year. And on third down, he's going to have J.J. Watt lined up next to him over Ezra Cleveland. And that's going to be one of those avenues, at least, where if both teams end up managing to kind of go off back and forth on each other, it's like you kind of say, man, both could kind of wreak havoc. It really would see in how those quarterbacks would adjust. And you kind of say, I think you give the edge to a healthy Murray being able to extend plays and scramble a bit more. Just because I think Kirk Cousins, while I think he's also more of you look at what he's done in his career, you look at his passing ability and even the fact that, he's kind of turned Adam Thielen into a huge weapon and turned Justin Jefferson into one of the greatest rookies we've ever seen in the NFL. I think not just even rookie wide receivers. You still wouldn't pick him to be the kind of guy who would be able to pick up a 3rd and 17 with his legs. That's just not one of those things that is all about Kirk's game whatsoever.
I don't really have much to add to that. I mean, it's going to be an interesting matchup. I think the one last question I wanted to ask was about Rodney Hudson, Kyler Murray, the ability to call protections, and the complex looks that the Vikings sometimes put out there. I think one of the commentators either during the game, or maybe I just saw it on Twitter and my brain has applied it both ways, is that, the Raiders were super happy with Andre James as center. That's why they were willing to let go of Rodney Hudson way back when. And the Chiefs obviously probably could use a player like Rodney Hudson. But one of his strengths is his ability to help identify fronts. You even just gave us a small anecdote of what that looks like. That relationship, how well do you think it'll handle, Mike Zimmer? I mean, it's not the most complex defense on the planet, but it's up there. And they just unveiled a whole new set of defensive fronts that I haven't seen from them before. Just in terms of, they're willing to go 3-4. They're willing to go with bear fronts, which we actually didn't see much against Cincinnati. They're willing to do a 4-3 under, or 4-3 over, a 3-4 under, a 3-4 Okie. All kinds of stuff that you've seen across the division in the NFC North, but you haven't seen with the Vikings. Plus, pair it with all the different blitz looks that the Vikings have. How comfortable are you with that relationship that those two have, and the command that Hudson has over protections, the authority that Kyler Murray has to kind of set protections to deal with that sort of thing? Because it's not as if the Titans don't blitz; they do, and you even gave us an example of what that looks like. But it's a different ball game every week.
Yeah, I think there was a kind of a preseason Cardinals question that people asked, hey, like, who's the most important player that they've added to this team in the offseason? It's like, hey, they got the rookie picks, Zaven Collins, Rondale Moore is going to have a big piece on offense, and then you add A.J. Green and J.J. Watt. And the Cardinals players themselves chimed in and said, it's none of those guys. And so it's like, okay, you're saying someone's more important to a team's success than J.J. Watt, and this is an NFL player speaking that. That really seems to speak highly of the likes of Rodney Hudson as far as his ability to be able to help anchor the line. Again, the Cardinals went from having pretty much, maybe a 31st or 32nd ranked center in the league last year in Mason Cole to a guy who probably ends up emerging this season top 5 if he can end up staying healthy. The Cardinals are able to put up a winning season. Maybe he ends up getting another Pro Bowl nod at 32 years of age. I think the bigger thing, at least for me, though, is I think that's one matchup that will be helpful for Kyler. I think the bigger matchup, honestly, that I would be looking at is how sometimes there are just some teams that just don't seem to do well with other teams, whether it's because of talent or because of the division. And I think this is why the number one matchup that I think that I have, at least for the upcoming game, is going to be the Cardinals wide receivers and the Vikings corners against the Cardinals corners and the Vikings receivers. Because last week we got to see where the defensive line, 5 sacks for Chandler Jones, all these forced fumbles, they just made Ryan Tannehill's life a living hell. You even got to see some physical play from Isaiah Simmons helping stuff Derrick Henry a couple of times where they just never got the run going. But they ran mostly simplistic routes with A.J. Brown and with Julio Jones, kind of two of these bigger, taller, there's some subtlety that they have to their routes, but they're more of the guys who can win with size and speed historically. The two guys they're playing up against in Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen are guys who can win with a combination of speed and routes. And they're going to be going up against Byron Murphy, at least, who is hoping that he can kind of make this kind of third year coming out party and become the team's next franchise corner. He's eligible to get extended for the first time this offseason. Marco Wilson, a guy who had I think it was a 42-inch vertical and had this freak athlete, just had an awesome freshman year at Florida and then just never kind of seemed to get back to it. Was still coming off injury after tearing his ACL for, I think it was either he tore his ACL 2 times or it was that he tore it on both knees. Either way, he put up a 40-inch vertical after that, has this explosive potential. And the team liked him well enough that that's part of the reason, apparently, that a lot of people have speculated why their other cornerback in Malcolm Butler retired, is that Wilson just seemed like he had a lot more juice to him. If they end up struggling where they get matched up more with Jefferson or 32-year-old Robert Alford, gets seen with one of those guys, whether it's in the slot or outside, if that ends up being a matchup where they are just not able to keep up with them, that could be a huge swing for the Minnesota Vikings this game. Unfortunately, I think, though, on the other side, I think you can make the same argument, and you could even look at the Cincinnati Bengals last week, where you could make a good argument that the type of offense the Bengals like to run, they kind of like to split it out with having, they got Higgins, Chase, and Boyd, these 3 wide receivers, and being able to kind of run the ball with Joe Mixon. You can make an argument that, okay, maybe you take a step back from the likes of Mixon, but you got probably the same type of spread out offense that the Bengals ran and were able to put up points with. And you've got a quarterback who's going to be a lot more mobile with Joe Burrow and has maybe at least a little bit protection, at least on one side. Poor Joe it feels like he just kind of keeps getting all these sacks for the most part. But I think that's one of those cases for the most part where if the Cardinals are able to get solid cornerback play and the Vikings are not, that's going to be one of the things that is going to flip the field in a huge advantage to the Cardinals. Likewise, I think it goes the same with the Vikings for the most part. I think that that's one of the avenues that you can say at least that's going to be kind of rough is like the Cardinals are going to struggle going up against, more of like the Bill Belichick or maybe even I think the Niners type of defense when you've got, a solid front that's able to play contain in Kyler Murray, can't make use of his legs and is able to disguise a lot of these looks. Maybe that ends up being the case with Zimmer, or maybe we end up seeing kind of a little bit of points put up like how the Bengals were able to last week at the cost, it seems that sometimes of Joe Burrow taking a nasty hit or two.
Right. Well, we did talk a little bit about the corners. Let's talk about the safeties a little bit. So Budda Baker, obviously last year, right before the season, signed an enormous deal. I was critical of it. He proved me wrong in pretty spectacular fashion. But it seems like he, along with Isaiah Simmons, Evan Collins, and then last year Hassan Reddick, were playing a kind of positionless football that I thought was really fascinating. We also see, I think, probably a more traditional safety in Jalen Thompson. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. What is it from the safety group that you see that kind of helps anchor that back end of that group of corners where you don't really have a lot of certainty about who they are yet?
Yeah, Budda's just kind of been a special player. Like the Cardinals drafted him and traded up for him in a move that a lot of people thought that they were going to be going after. I think it was 2017. They, thought that they could get the likes of a Watson or Mahomes could fall to them at pick 13. I don't know what their GM was smoking that day because it was like no way that every team knew that they were looking at one of those quarterbacks. They trade up in the second round for Budda Baker because they saw him in the same kind of mold as a Tyrann Mathieu who'd been on their team. And he's essentially kind of developed into this multifaceted player that you kind of have to have eyes on him at all times because he's not only got the ability to be this, deep speed center fielder that can break up a deep pass just with this incredible burst and closing speed. But talking about a player who, despite being the smaller 5'9", what is it with the Cardinals and 5'9" players? I don't know. Maybe they just really seem to like that. But talking about a guy who made like a viral video this week where he was blitzing with Taylor Lewan. Lewan gets slightly a little bit off balance, but Baker just bowls him over. So you're like, okay, as a 6'6", 300-pound guy, you got a 5'9", 195-pound safety just runs him over. And so that sort, I think, of tenacity, the closing speed, and then just a lot of the smarts that he had. Most people only think about Budda Baker when they think about him on the NFL, like talking about the casual, the average fan. Most people know him from the DK Metcalf memes where he just ran after him and tracked him down, where it's just like, right. Oh, here's me at least having a nice night in, and then DK Metcalf behind my alarm clock that I accidentally set for 4 p.m. instead of 4 p.m. or something like that. And it's like people know that from the memes, but a lot of people forget that Baker was a guy who prepped and recognized the I think it was like a quick swing pass that Russell Wilson was going to make to a corner. He just runs in, jumps the route, and takes it back for that one. He really blossomed into his own last year as far as his coverage skills, and the fact that the Cardinals have a stronger defensive line and now have Isaiah Simmons being able to kind of flex in between a linebacker to sometimes even rushing off of the edge, it's allowed him to kind of be back more in that coverage role. To be able to help maybe, some of the young corners. There was a time or two we saw him in the box last week, but there wasn't a lot of Budda Baker's name being called. And sometimes you're like, okay, that may not be great, but other times you're like, that's really good for a free safety because it means that things are buttoned up on the back end. It means that he's able to have solid coverage and awareness. And he's been kind of the overall leader of the Cardinals team in a lot of ways. He took over as a team captain after Chandler Jones. And I think the bigger question is going to be if Jalen Thompson, who seemed to flash and be kind of the team's kind of almost like, your center fielder to keep Budda in the box, and as a rookie in 2019, and then missed practically the entire season last year after an injury in the first game of the year, and really is kind of needs to come into his own a bit more. I know the Vikings, at least as far as their safety goes, you're talking about, Xavier Woods is a guy who I think has been a solid addition, but Harrison Smith just getting that contract. This is going to be kind of two star safeties that I think could definitely make plays on Sunday, and it'll be interesting to see if, one makes a bigger play than the other, as they are almost two different types of players as far as, you got right. A player in Budda Baker who probably plays like Harrison Smith. He just isn't Harrison Smith's size is a good way to describe him.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it. I briefly mentioned those linebackers. You've briefly mentioned the linebackers, Isaiah Simmons, Zaven Collins. Technically linebackers, Chandler Jones, Marcus Golden, Kylie Fitz, all them. But it's those two inside backers that are interesting. There's also Jordan Hicks, who, man, there was like a year in Philadelphia where he was like extremely good, and that was kind of it.
Yeah.
What is your kind of read on these two, and what is it about the nature of the Cardinals defense that requires these guys that have edge rusher experience, that have safety experience, that have traditional linebacker experience, that in college occasionally lined up over the slot? What is it about these guys that they needed to have, that they were willing to spend back-to-back first-round picks on? And how does the defense use them well? Or if the defense doesn't use them well, if they've got a lot more potential that the coordinating is not taking advantage of, what's the story there?
Yeah, so the Zaven Collins pick, at least when it first dropped, there was a maybe not like surprise amongst Cardinals fans. I think there was the kind of, maybe some of the core people who cover the team when that news broke out was like, that makes a lot of sense. And I was like, wait, what do you mean? Like, they need like a corner, or they need like, a speed threat, because, Andy Isabella, he'll have like one catch for 17 yards and he'll call that a good season. So a lot of questions popped up, at least wondering like, what's going on? They just took Simmons last year. And some of it, I think, is because they kind of figured out in their system, because there's so much as far as for what they run under Vance Joseph, is in a lot of cases there's similarities in some regards to not just maybe a little bit of Mike Zimmer, but there's even a touch of the kind of a little touch of the Belichick 4-3, or you could even call it the Wade Phillips 3-4, where you're kind of running a 4-3 system. It's just that
it's a one gap 3-4.
Yeah, it's a one gap 3-4 for the most part. Yeah. And then you kind of have the guy who would normally be like your, down defensive end on one side is actually a stand-up linebacker. And then you're able to, have your Mike and your Mo as far as those linebackers in the middle. And then he can run a lot as far as the zero gap pressures, where you got 6 guys lined up on the line of scrimmage. And then you can either suddenly blitz up the middle, you get a guy with wide open on the quarterback, or like we saw in the infamous Seattle game last year, you saw the Cardinals bail on that package. Russell Wilson sees like, oh, time to go ahead and just hit the quick route at least, and they bailed into the package. He throws right into an interception. It kind of is the way that they show these different pressure packages and being able to make use of a lot of their talents, where they really like these hybrid players, in part because having that sort of adaptability, not only does it help when, you have players who get hurt or go down, but it can make it a nightmare for a defense when you're a quarterback standing back and like, all right, let's go ahead and survey this. So I've got, Zaven Collins is a guy up the middle. You've got on this edge, you've got, Budda Baker suddenly is lined up in the slot. Okay, Isaiah Simmons is on this edge for the most part. You got Chandler Jones and J.J. Watt on this side. And then Marcus Golden, he's kind of no slouch. He's a guy who I think there was the one year he had an ACL. The next year he had double-digit sacks, and then he was traded to Arizona. But when you look at how he's used in that 3-4 scheme, he's just a pure 3-4, Sam linebacker. He's not going to be a guy who is super explosive, but he's a guy who just doesn't give up on the play, is a smart player. And then suddenly you see Isaiah Simmons back into a safety look, and it's Budda Baker blitzes you off of the slot corner. And you realize, okay, so that's giving all of those different looks as far as being able to manufacture pressure is one avenue of the Cardinals that we saw with Vance Joseph adjusted, because without Chandler Jones, they had to kind of be able to find different places to get pressure from. But when they do have the ability to gain pressure with 4, you kind of look at these kind of, you're able to rush 4, get pressure, and then drop all these guys into zone coverage. And a lot of that focus on ball skills, a lot of that focus on being able to, maintain coverage while also being able to have a good knack against the run. It kind of creates almost the way I would call it is like, if the Cardinals offense is going to be a Swiss Army knife, it's going to be more of like, like what is it? I'm trying to think of like, like a dual wielding ninja or something like that, where, you can be fighting with the swords and suddenly then all of a sudden a foot comes out of nowhere. That's kind of, I think, one of the avenues of the Cardinals really did a strange avenue of they invested, outside of Budda Baker. They just have these big, tall, long, and fast athletes on the offensive side of the ball. And they called them the 2 trees, I think, with Zaven Collins. And, Jordan Hicks showed last year that he's probably lost a step, especially when it comes to his coverage skills. But they've been working him in slowly since he's still a smart player. Against the Titans, Zaven Collins, when he came in, it was essentially, hey, you show a run look, we bring in Zaven in. Even on some of the pass looks, his responsibilities were kept pretty clean, where he was just able to, get after the passer up the middle. And this is a guy who's like, long arm 6'4" guy who, I think had like multiple game ending interceptions for Tulsa last year. It was like, okay, this is a guy that kind of matches up with the Donta Hightower type mold, if you think of him coming out of Alabama, for that size and speed and just some of those instincts. He's been kind of getting worked in slowly. He played for probably about, I want to say maybe 40% of the snaps. And Jordan Hicks was a guy who was able to be on the field for the others. So just being able to kind of use those mismatches as far as the size and speed, it really is kind of gives the Cardinals in a lot of ways sometimes, a size advantage, because they can then use those bigger athletes to stop the run up front. And if you decide to pass out of it, those guys are not going to get burned in coverage. So that's been part of where you can kind of see them paint this picture of what they've kind of wanted to be. The closest comparison I've given is it's not really the same defensive line as Seattle, but if you were saying, hey, you get two really good older pass rushers up front, you're talking about these, two freaks moving around the field with Bobby Wagner and even Cam Chancellor. And you talk about in the back end, if you can just run cover 3 with guys who have ball skills and Boot is finishing it. I think that's the approach the Cardinals have wanted to have. And it's unfortunate because, you look at this has been the NFC West we're talking about. It seems to run these elite defenses out each year over year. And I could see the Cardinals, potentially ending up back into the top 10 of those defenses, despite the fact that, most people have either never heard of their cornerback room or are just seeing how inexperienced it is. And maybe you're writing it off a little bit too quickly, as we saw from the Titans game.
What is it about Jordan Hicks that he seemed to play so much better for Philadelphia than for Arizona?
Well, I think it's youth. Like, he was, as far as that year, his coverage grade was just like outstanding. The Cardinals brought him in expecting that he could use that coverage. I don't know if some of it is just the Phillies being able to adjust on the outside. Maybe some of it could be their safeties, but I did see from 2019 to 2020, and this is even from watching his 2018 tape. It's like, okay, it looks like he lost a step going from 2018 to 2019. Like, there were times where he was just a little bit late. When the Cardinals drafted Isaiah Simmons, people are like, perfect, cool. He'll take over for, Jordan Hicks and you can play them next to each other. And then I was like, I don't see Isaiah Simmons as a Mike linebacker. Like, you're kind of taking, a guy who's, his best role is like more of a Derwin James, Tyrann Mathieu, like move him all over kind of role. You can't just plug him in and say he's a Mike. And he lost a step at least later in the year last year as well, coming into this year. So Hicks is probably one of the guys who you could say that right now on the team, you're like, okay, this is a guy that you should find other people seeing as a mismatch. But it does seem like that he's, for whatever reason, it might be a little bit fresher, and using some of those different smarts has been able to, Arizona's kind of put him into that role where by working Zaven Collins in, it's kept him healthier, because he was on the field for, I want to say, like 98% of Arizona's defensive snaps, like the last 2 years. He's had like an insane amount of usage as far as for being able to take on. He was calling the plays as far as being their, defensive play caller last year. They've kind of taught Zaven Collins to be able to be that this year, but by working the two of them in together, I think it's been able to give him at least a little bit of fresh enough legs that he's able to keep going. And it just feels like that's one of those areas of where I wouldn't expect him to go past this year in Arizona. They clearly are, they were ready to move on from him. It sounds like in the preseason with Steve Keim coming out and essentially saying, hey, like, this is going to be your starting Mike linebacker. It's our first round pick. Jordan, sorry, you don't get a chance to compete for the role. And we've kind of seen a little pushback on that from the coaches, as he still played quite a number of the snaps and seems to have an important part in this defense. It's just very clear that he's not quite the player that he was in Philly. And that's some of the danger of free agency. But enough about some of the Cardinals linebackers. I want to hear you analyze what in the world is going on with this week's linebackers against the Cardinals, because you take a look at, all right, you got Anthony Barr and Eric Kendricks. Wait, you might not have Anthony Barr or Eric Kendricks, and that just turns into like a, oh no kind of avenue, at least as a Cardinals fan who has watched some pretty bad linebacker play from 2018, the year that the Cardinals had probably the worst linebacker group in the league.
Yeah, Eric Kendricks did not participate. Anthony Barr did not participate. Kendricks was not on the injury report on Wednesday, which seems to imply that he wasn't injured in the game, but was injured either in Wednesday practice or after Wednesday practice. Could be that, he sustained an injury, was just gutting through it. But yeah, neither of them participated. Anthony Barr seems to have a persistent knee issue. I think it's like tendonitis. That has been bothering him actually for years. And so his lack of participation is not a shock, although it is frustrating. And they didn't put him on injured reserve because they expected him to be able to play in the next couple of games. In fact, he was supposed to be 50-50 for week one. So the fact that he still hasn't participated in practice, pretty big deal. but yeah, if they don't have either of them, obviously Nick Vigil ends up becoming the most experienced linebacker in that group. Vigil was a limited participant in practice, but he's going to play. He was already last week. He was the green dot, so he was the one calling the defensive plays. And after that, it's going to be Blake Lynch, who is the third linebacker with Anthony Barr out, and probably Troy Dye, not Chaz Surratt. So we'll kind of see how that goes. Not crazy confident because we saw what happened when both of them were out last year because Anthony Barr got injured in week 2 of last season, and Eric Kendricks got injured with 5 games left to go, and not having either of them was pretty awful. Sure. That's a group where, that's a group where the Vikings are going to need a lot of help from that defensive line unit up front to kind of clear things away. If not, I would not overly complicate things if I were the Cardinals. I would probably just zone read those linebackers to oblivion. That's just
man. That's going to be really interesting, that matchup. It's going to be really interesting to see, at least. If the Cardinals are not as much of a misdirection type offense in some ways, but we've seen them get a bit more pre-snap motion in as far as it goes with Moore and for other people in the preseason. So it'll be really interesting to see how that turns out as far as if both of those guys have to go, if Zim's able to cover for them or if that ends up getting exposed on Sunday at least. Because I know a lot of Cardinals fans are going in confident. I've been like, I'd hold back in being like this confident as far as like, I think there's a few issues that pop up, but a lot of Cardinals fans, I think, are going in expecting to win this game. And part of it, I think, is ultimately that it just feels like that's going to be a rough go with the Vikings being down not just one, but both of their starting linebackers.
Yeah, we'll see. Kendricks is scheduled, I think, for an MRI, so we'll see kind of, which obviously means that they're concerned that it might be a long-term issue, but we'll see how much of that, ends up playing out. Just real quick before we get to letting us both go and watch Thursday Night Football.
You're watching that game? You're going to watch that game? It's going to be backup for Washington against, Daniel Jones against maybe a top 2, maybe the best D-line in football. I'm not one to be a sucker for pain, but at least it's
Taylor Heineke, former Viking. Former Viking. So we'll see if he can gut it out. And hey, Ryan Fitzpatrick, I guess is not getting surgery, so we'll see him back sooner rather than later. But yeah, Chandler Jones. First question: he just crossed 100 sacks. Is he a Hall of Famer?
I think that if you look at the case, and he's already, if he gets 1.5 sacks over the rest of the season, kind of as an average, he'll be coming for Strahan's all-time record. He came close, I believe, in 2019. He came close in 2017 as well. He was behind Shaq Barrett that year, but had I think it was 19.5 sacks. So I think that it's one of those things of where I think that depending on, he's got a good relationship with the media. If he retired today, is he a Hall of Famer? I think that may be, here or not. Maybe it's on the line, maybe not. If he has another season or two where he's able to get, double-digit sacks or more, and he, I think I did the numbers. If he plays for at least 4 more years and is able to be relatively consistent, there's an outside chance that he might not get in there, but there's an outside chance he finishes in the top 10. And at that point, I think that he would be a lock for the Hall of Fame. I think I can tell you for sure that, the Cardinals, after the game on Sunday, he had 5 sacks. The Cardinals owner and the GM, Steve Keim, came down to kind of talk to him and congratulate him on, tying Cardinals franchise record. And his response was to walk up to the Cardinals general manager and started patting his pockets like, hey, what you got in here for money? Are you going to be extending me here? And I think that's one of the avenues that the Cardinals, they wanted to see him in a contract year. If he gets extended and is able to make these plays and, the defense that he's in, the way that they design it is where he does get a lot of one-on-one matchups, at least just because of the way that the Vance Joseph's defense is run. I do think that he's got, you can't really guarantee a shot. I think that he would go from 2 more seasons of high-level play. I think you could probably guarantee that he would get into the Hall. I don't know if you can guarantee, it's a first ballot at least, unless he ends up kind of pushing into closer to that top 10 sort of range. And there's been a lot of good pass rushers. It's just crazy because, he was doing a really good job in the Patriots 4-3 scheme. But once he moved out to Arizona as a stand-up linebacker, it's like he's playing a position that was almost made for him. And he's just a complete freak as far as, you don't see guys who have that kind of movement at that size with that sort of crazy arms. So there's a reason why he forces so many fumbles is because, he wraps around, gives you a bear hug, and knocks the ball away all the same. I do think that if you had to say yes or no, I'd put like 55% yes, 45% no on it, like right at this moment. If he can continue to keep this pace up throughout the season, he's not going to average, if he averages 5 sacks a game for the most part, then, mortal men will fear to tread in his presence, but that's not going to happen. So I could definitely see it being one of those spots of where you're talking about a guy who is, an all-time great, and adding J.J. Watt to be there next to him, even if Watt is more of 2017 Watt than this peak and in his prime 2014 Watt, it still seems to be enough to make a difference, at least, that teams are going to have to really just be able to respect them.
Is the most athletic member of the defensive line Zach Allen?
Ooh, good question. I think what's really interesting with Zach Allen is that I still think, if you're talking about defensive linemen and everything, he's probably, you'd think, would be one of the most athletic players. He just has been, for whatever reason, hasn't seemed to click. Like, he came out, I know there's other people, I think I had like a either high second round grade on him, thought that he was a guy who, you can plug him in as a kind of 5 technique. He'll get batted balls. He'll get maybe about 6 to 8 sacks a year. He just has never either been healthy enough to kind of click. We saw last week that Michael Dogby, even the 6th round pick the Cardinals made, he's kind of their
Temple guy.
Yeah, that was him. He's been like on and off the roster. Like, it's like, hey, the Cardinals are promoting this Michael Dogby from the practice squad. All right, you need a kicker this week, and Michael Dogby has reverted to the practice squad. Like, he would just be on and off the roster, but he's kind of showing up a bit this year where he was one of those guys that they kept, and some of it is due to the play that they did. What's really interesting is the Cardinals drafted a pair of defensive tackles last year in Rashard Lawrence and Leki Fotu. And if you had to ask me to pick the best athlete, I would probably pick between all of those guys, Fotu at least is the one who maybe is surprising to some. But as far as when you're talking about a traditional nose tackle, more of your Polynesian player, like, he was a former rugby player growing up, and he weighs in at approximately 330 pounds, and he moves like a 300-pounder. So that's probably, if I had to pick the biggest athlete on the Cardinals offensive line, it's 100% Leki Fotu. He is just kind of one of those strange, like, nose tackles that, when they drafted him at the time, most of what we said, and this is, watching Pac-12 football. I'm an ASU fan, not a masochist. That's why I watch Pac-12 football. But this is a guy who you're like, oh, hey, this is a guy who's like your typical, one-gap nose tackle who's supposed to just be a run stuffer, and yet he would still be able to get pressure on the quarterback just because he had the strength and burst to get upfield. That he's still a guy who could probably, run into about 3 sacks a year or so for the most part, despite the fact that he's a 330-pound man. 330 is not supposed to move like exactly like he does. I don't think it's a spot where he's quite the player who can blossom into a star. He's got a lot of work, but I think that he's got a chance to be able to be a good nose tackle so long as he can keep his knees clean, because it's the biggest thing about when you weigh 330 pounds, you get one knee injury and suddenly it just transforms who you are as a player because of all of that bulk you have to carry on and move at the NFL level.
Final defensive line question. J.J. Watt had a phenomenal game against the run. Part of the reason that Isaiah Simmons also had a great game against the run. Is he a pass rush threat at this point in his career?
Yeah, he's not the pass rush threat that he was. I think that part of the benefit that you'll see is that he had pressure that was there on Ryan Tannehill, at least. I know it was 2 or 3 times. I think that he still is one, but it'd be more likely from the interior. Like, the Cardinals, because of that 3-4 they run, which is really like,
which is where he started out his career, right?
Yeah, he started out with the Houston Texans for all that. You think about that defensive end. Well, he's kind of been, on one of the plays, he said he kind of opted into the inside for the most part. And if you take a look at what the Titans ran, he was actually lining up with a hand in the dirt versus being, that stand-up outside linebacker. So I do think that it's one of the cases where I don't think that he's going to be a guy who gets double-digit sacks this year. I don't think he's going to be a guy who straight ends up holding, lanes open for other players. That's something that normally you see from some of the nose tackles in the Cardinals, like you think of Corey Peters and others. But Vance Joseph does have a lot of times where he'll have plays where he will get pressure right up the middle, at least for that one. Like Corey Peters had, I believe it was a sack fumble last year, and he has guys who can, if they've got the ability to penetrate and get upfield, I think that they will be able to get some production. I think the question has always been, like, what level of production will that be? It wouldn't shock me if J.J. Watt's a guy who you could say, hey, he's disruptive, he's made a lot of plays against the run. He only had 6.5 sacks, but then you look at the rest of the Cardinals, and they were a team that had, I think they were 4th in sacks in the league last year. You talk about a lot of those players. I could see it being a spot where, maybe ends up pushes, gets about 8 sacks or so, and you can kind of say, hey, he's not the same player he was, but he's still going to, at times, like, be able to wreak havoc, or maybe even just, he's going to know exactly that this is a fake play action call. He's going to get a jump on a guard who's, not expecting it and be able to get after the quarterback in that regard. So I think that I could say the answer to that is like, yes, but not quite the player he once was. That said, I do think anyone who's saying like the JJ Watt is washed, or like there's much more likelihood that AJ Green at least hasn't been quite at that status than I think there is JJ Watt. He's playing like he's probably going to be good for the Cardinals, maybe not great, but he'll be good for at least another 2 years or so. And I think he'll be disruptive enough. And as we saw on Sunday, like Titans in whatever case were like, we want to basically take JJ Watt out of the game and we'll leave Chandler Jones one-on-one. And as a result of Watt's presence, it really made that Sunday where I think Tannehill's probably going to wake up from having a Chandler Jones nightmare at least this week, at least 2 or 3 times.
All right, we'll get to a score prediction in a second. Bonus question. I know you're going to love answering this. How much better is the defense with a healthy Dennis Gardeck?
Whew, that's tough because Gardeck is he's like the mini Marcus Golden. Like they call him Gardeck the Barbarian is the Phoenix term, because he's a guy who essentially made his living on special teams of just, not like being a headhunter, like the looking for concussions or a Vontaze Burfict type, but he was just a guy who would essentially have this solid play of just being able to blow up some of the opposing defensive schemes. So if you start putting him opposite on that other side, he was a guy who people were kind of surprised he had to play after Jones went out, and he showed not just a bull rush move, but this relenting nature where it's just it was just weird because it was he flew off of the edge, and there was times where it looked like Watt. Now, it's not obviously the same athlete, but you would see that same type of, you can almost call it killer instinct that you have in some of the best pass rushers today, where you just kind of know that it doesn't really matter. You can put a chip a running back on me. I'm throwing that running back aside and getting after the quarterback. It'll be interesting. He's coming off of an ACL. He's currently, I believe, on IR due to the fact that he ended up hurting, I think it was either a pectoral muscle or a bicep. He's going to be back in time for the Rams game. But as we saw last year with the Cardinals, at their best, this is a team that really has a lot of different ways that they can get after the passer. And that's one of the places I think where a lot has been built into this 1 year for Arizona. And part of that year was including, as crazy as it seems, Dennis Gardeck, as far as efficiency goes, was their best pass rusher last year. I mean, with Hassan Reddick, he went and rushed against the Giants, and we'll see how the Giants do tonight. Maybe that's not much of an accomplishment. But Gardeck was consistent enough to the point where if you add him, even if it's in a small amount, it's just going to be another avenue that adds to that Arizona pass rush where I think that you would see a boost for sure. But you'd have to see what the splits would be like with him and without. But I think a lot of what it comes down to with the Cardinals, at least for this year, is they finally at least have, for the first time since Cliff Kingsbury, an identity of how to get after the passer through both being able to have guys up front if they need to rush for that they can still get pressure, or being able to bring it from multiple angles. They want to be a team that can hunt the quarterback and try to make life easier for some of their defensive backs. And that's fun to see because throughout the first 3 years, we've had kind of no idea what Vance Joseph was wanting to do with defense. And then it kind of seemed to solidify itself last year. And the offseason signings, bringing guys like Gardeck back, bringing Watt in, you really can kind of see it. They're trying to go for a team that wants to finally, shut off of the kind of 4th place in the NFC West that everyone talks about them, put that chip back on the shoulder and try to go out and finally win games. Because, if they don't, and a lot of people have questioned whether the head coach and the GM will have their jobs next year if they end up, dropping down the stretch like they did in 2020.
All right. And then the final bit here is a score prediction. Arizona coming off of a crushing victory over a playoff opponent in the Tennessee Titans. The Vikings coming off of an embarrassing loss to a top 5 picking team from last year. Vikings are on the road against Arizona. Arizona is favored by 3.5.
Yeah, I would probably at least, this is tough because I would probably take that as far as the 3.5. I think that just when you're looking at the end of the day, I think that the Arizona defensive line, I think at least matches up better than the Vikings offensive line, especially when you flip it and see that, the Vikings, I think, have a solid player in Danielle Hunter. But I just think that overall, the Cardinals, at least with the veteran help that they have, I think are just a bit better as far as that goes. And I think that when you talk about the weaknesses of the corners, just from what we've had as far as the play, I just feel like that's going to be one of those avenues of that the Cardinals have an advantage with the receiver position, even with, the fact that I like the receivers better in Thielen and Jefferson probably than Arizona's for. it just feels like that when you're talking about the play that they have as far as with Breland and the others, it just feels like there was avenues at least last week where it was difficult to, it was difficult at times, I think, for the Vikings to be able to just kind of put the game away at times as far as the passing game went. So we'll see. I've got it as being kind of a barn burner. I've got Arizona winning by 4, 31-27. It wouldn't shock me if that ends up getting flipped. If, let's say, the Cardinals turn the ball over twice, Vikings can make it pay. But I just look at that linebacker group for the most part for the Vikings, and it got to feel like that even if the Vikings pass rush gets after it, I just feel like Arizona is going to offensively find some ways to take advantage of it. I don't think it's going to be a complete blowout like it was in the last game with the Titans, because I've got way too much confidence in how I think Kirk is going to be able to find his receivers. And I think that, the Vikings will get a little bit on tape. Maybe you see a little bit of a different, more diverse game. But I do think at least that the Cardinals will at least win. I could see it being like a 31-21 game heading into the fourth, a little bit of a comeback. And then we'll see if Arizona can be able to close it out like they did against the Titans. What are your thoughts on the game?
I think that I would probably take Arizona as well. 3-point favorites. I think I would take Arizona and the points. I think they cover. I obviously set it up. I poisoned the well by talking about how bad the Vikings were against a team that is not representative of the team that they are now, and kind of the same thing with Arizona. But I do think that there is something there. I think the Vikings were much better than what they than the kind of the final yardage statistics of the Bengals game, but I also think that the Cardinals are better than they were last year. So could be a close game, but I think that Arizona is probably just going to come out ahead. I think that Kyler Murray shows the kind of requisite improvement you need to be able to be confident to make that kind of decision. But yeah, I just don't see, especially if those linebackers are out, I just don't see the room for the Vikings to be able to have control of the game. I don't think the Cardinals will be as good against the run this week as they were last week. I think that was somewhat of an anomaly, and it's difficult to replicate from week to week to week. But I think that the pass rush is going to be there. I think that it's going to be difficult to rely on the run. And I think that the linebacker issue that the Vikings suddenly have is going to probably rear its head. So, yeah, I'm taking Arizona in the points, but, it's a much more interesting team to cover if they're 1-1 than if they're 0-2. So, from my job perspective, I would rather that the Vikings win.
Yeah, no, and I think that's also the case of the NFL can be full of surprises. Like if you looked at people, including myself, who would have picked the Cardinals to beat the Titans in a blowout, you'd probably found most people being like, oh yeah, it'll be a high scoring game. And most people would have picked the Titans to be the one that would have blown out the Cardinals, vice versa. I could see it definitely being a area where the game is a lot closer than people who are just trying to pick a Cardinals blowout and look at those Vikings players missing. I would agree with you in that regard. That's kind of, I think, going to be the spot where trying to caution people like, hey, don't just assume that the Cardinals are going to go in and put up a walloping because they did last week. This is, after all, the National Football League.
All right. Well, that was a great conversation, a little bit more extensive than I think a lot of the conversations I have on the podcast, which is saying a lot. Where can readers or listeners find your work?
I was going to say, you kept asking questions like, all right, we just kind of keep rolling, which is great. So you can find that work on revengeofthebirds.com. I've got an article at least that kind of comes up with this week about why the Cardinals could win the NFC West. Now, spoiler alert, some of it does involve, the other teams in the NFC West, taking hits or taking a step back. So that's one thing at least of realism there. But you can find the rest of the tweets also at Blake Murphy 7. I've got the ROTB pod at least is going through trying to see if I can go back to getting more of the weekly guests, kind of in interviews like this to be able to do opposing team previews. I think you do learn a whole lot more, but yeah, come and check all of that out at least for if you're a Cardinals fan listening to this as a Vikings pod, or if you just want a little bit more insight, about what's going to be going on with Larry Fitzgerald, who for whatever reason still has not officially retired yet, and we'll see what happens as far as or if that door is just barely cracked open or if he's just waiting for someone to throw a checkbook through the window.
Yeah, bring him back to Minnesota. We'll see. All right. Thanks so much, man.
Hey, thank you.
All right, let's go to the mailbag. And the first question is from Raul, who asks, Arizona looks scary good against the Titans, a team with a similar offensive identity to our own. What exactly is the Cardinals' weakness, and how can we exploit it?
Yeah, some of that was covered in the interview with Blake. Honestly, I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that the Cardinals are somewhat kind of one-dimensional. I don't mean that by the fact that they're run through DeAndre Hopkins and Kyler Murray, more that schematically, despite kind of the reputation that Kingsbury has, there's not like a whole lot going on. Like the run game isn't super interesting outside of zone reads. It is primarily just a receiver to receiver offense. He mentioned that they don't do really matchups, so they don't really exploit matchups in the same way. And there's another question about DeAndre Hopkins later in the mailbag, where I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So I think that it limits some of the upside that Arizona has. But then also the other part of that is that they're a very young team with a bunch of versatile players. And I think Vikings fans are kind of used to what the promise of that means. And, we just saw what Arizona did to the Titans and what that versatility can do from a positive perspective. But if it's such a young team with so much versatility, there is probably a really good chance that there's going to be screw ups, especially with Zaven Collins, Isaiah Simmons, first and second year linebackers playing multiple positions within that defense. So if the Vikings are as committed to kind of the pre-snap motion stuff that we saw in the preseason, it's a little bit harder to do given the game situation in the Bengals, or if they can put themselves into situations where these play action a lot more often, I think that you can probably create a lot of confusion. Also, as Blake was pointing out, those corners are not good. They're not confirmed to be good, I guess is a better way to put it. And so when you've got nuanced route runners like the Vikings have, there's going to be opportunities there. I just think that the primary concern is to eliminate the impact that pressure will have. I mean, everyone's been talking about, Chandler Jones's 5 sacks and what that might mean going up against Rashad Hill. And there's just a bunch of ways that you're going to have to deal with that. Either, put a tight end there and keep him in pass protection on some plays, put a running back there, keep him in pass protection on some plays, run slants, screens, quick outs, stuff like that. Play a fast passing game, bootleg away from Chandler Jones. So that's something that you can do is you can have a moving pocket away from him. All kinds of things, slide protection in that direction, stuff like that. So, there's a lot of options. Remember, Vegas only has the Cardinals by 3. So a lot of the stuff that seemed negative from the Vikings, a lot of people seem to think that that's unsustainable. I explained in the last episode why that might be the case. Could also be the case alternately on the positive side for the Cardinals.
All right, let's go to the next question. And that'll be from Mathis, who sent us a real nice note and this question. Considering Bradbury's bad playing, is there a chance that Mason Cole starts as the center for the Vikings this season?
Not this season. And you have to remember that if we ignore kind of the one game sample of this season, Bradbury's had a higher PFF grade than Mason Cole. So it's not as if it's like clear that Mason Cole is a better player. I thought he looked pretty good in the preseason. That was nice to see. And I think that when offensive linemen, second team offensive linemen do well against second team defensive linemen, that's a bit more meaningful than other situations where you've got a second team receiver against a second team cornerback or vice versa, or second team quarterback against a second team defense, because there's more depth along the defensive line in the NFL than there's along the offensive line. So I think there might be something there, but we have to remember Mason Cole was not all that great for the Cardinals. That's why they traded him away for a 6th-round pick. Listening to Blake, they were talking about that as an absolute win, right? So that's something that is probably just going to be the case. The Vikings really love his ability to run block, not something that Mason Cole does to the same degree. I should say move in run blocking, because there are some instances where his run blocking is not there, but his ability to kind of move as a run blocker, Cole just doesn't have that. And then also, if you were to ask me to break down Mason Cole's strengths and weaknesses, weakness number 1 is the ability to snap the ball. And I can't really get behind a center where that's your number 1 weakness. So I'm not like crazy about this plan. Maybe in like 6 weeks, if you ask me the same thing, I'm going to be a little bit more open to it. But right now, I just kind of don't see that avenue.
Let's go to Tep, who asks, you talked a lot over the offseason about Kirk's trade value being about a 1st-round pick. Would that still be true if the Vikings lose enough games to result in Zim/Rick being gone? If so, who would take the Vikings up on that? I can't think of many teams that would be interested.
So there's 2 problems with this. The first is that there's only 1 year left on Kirk Cousins' contract, so what you're trading for is only 1 year of a contract. The second thing is that his cap is $45 million next year. And so it is a little bit different than trading for 2 years of a top 10-ish quarterback at the 33 then $45 million cap hit. So that's like kind of the primary issue with that. And then kind of additionally, it would seem as if, given kind of how many quarterbacks have entered the league in the past couple of years, it would seem as if he enters the market, the team that would want to sign him doesn't have as much competition as they would have had a year ago or 2 years ago, because so many of these teams have been able to draft a quarterback that they're going to at least invest some resources into, right? So if they want him, they can wait until after the season and then sign him, and then the Vikings get a 3rd round pick. So that's going to kind of limit that upside. That said, I still would not be shocked that he'd receive interest in a draft pick. It kind of depends. If a quarterback gets injured before the season, they could do a Sam Bradford thing. Remember, Bradford, traded for a 1st round pick. It's there, right? It's possible. But it kind of has to depend on how desperate that team is and how close they think they are to winning. So one team that it would make a lot of sense for, but would never happen, of course, is Washington, who've had their years with Kirk. But, we just saw this game with Taylor Heineke. I don't know that the Heineke experiment's going to continue, beyond the next couple of games. Obviously, they're going to give him a shot after a great 2-minute drill. But he wasn't that accurate. And so I don't know that he's going to be able to maintain his capability to be a high-level quarterback, but that team is so good that you would think that with a quarterback, they'd be able to compete. So that would be a good team for him to go on if he hadn't already had this history of being kind of screwed by them. So I was trying to think of other teams where they might be willing to trade for a guy like him. If Carson Wentz gets injured again or something, maybe the Colts. And by that, I mean kind of before next year. They've got just a really great supporting cast. That offensive line did get a little bit weaker with that retirement, but they've got a fairly strong defense. Probably, it didn't look amazing last week, but probably a strong defense. They've got a good, offensive line otherwise, and some promising skill position players. The Texans will do anything, so I put them on the list. I don't think the Giants are going to give up on Daniel Jones, but, I put them on the list anyway, because why not? And then if the Lions screw around and win too many games, which doesn't seem, amazingly likely, but they did kind of come back-ish against the 49ers, they might be out of range of a quarterback. My understanding of the way that people are interpreting this quarterback class is that they're not very impressed with the people that in the preseason that they were paying attention to. So it's like Spencer Rattler, Matt Corral, and a couple of other players that have just not really gotten people excited. So if that's the case, a team like the Lions might say, hey, we're picking 6th or whatever. I don't like our quarterback options there, but I like our team. I don't know that the Lions have a good enough team where that would make sense, but I think it's possible. And then I think the funniest and possibly most painful version, if it doesn't work out, is if the Packers are actually not sold on Jordan Love, after Aaron Rodgers leaves, which is essentially what all this negotiating the offseason resulted in, that his ability to leave after this year, and you could see it, they've got a great offensive line. They've got at least one really high-level receiver. They've got pieces on defense. They never really put them all together. But I can't think of anything like more interesting than that. So I got to put that down.
Well, let's go over to Beef Brewski, who asks, how many sacks are we going to see on Kirk?
I assume you mean this week. I'm going to say less than Tannehill. Cousins is not amazing about getting rid of the ball to prevent sacks, but he's also not like awful at it. And so, right, like he's not like a Peyton Manning or even a Case Keenum or a Phillip Rivers in terms of getting rid of the ball out to prevent pressure or to prevent pressure from turning into sacks. But he's not quite like Teddy Bridgewater holding onto the ball or Aaron Rodgers. Who that's probably his biggest weakness, is that he's so unwilling to throw the pick that he takes the sack, right? Which, there's a trade-off there, right? The sack is better than the pick, but the odds of the pick are lower, so, whatever. He does hold on to the ball a lot. Some of that is the scheme, some of that's who he is, but he doesn't take sacks as much as some of these other quarterbacks. So I don't think we're going to see 6 sacks, but I do think that we might see 3, maybe one of them from Jones. I don't know. I certainly don't think the answer is 0.
Yeah, probably not. Mark Hogan asks, DraftKings is setting DeAndre Hopkins at 86.5 yards, third highest among pass catchers this weekend. How far below that number does it need to be for Patrick Peterson to call it a successful trip back to Arizona?
Probably 35 yards, right? If he gets, well, no, because that implies if he got like 55 yards, that would not be. So let's go with like 26, right? If DeAndre Hopkins is limited to 60 yards, I think everyone's pretty happy about that. 70 and above, you're like, that's not successful. So yeah, that's probably it. And here's where I kind of want to explain. This will probably be a direct, what's the word I'm looking for? Test is the concept I'm thinking of, so I'll just use that. It's a litmus test. It's probably the best accounting we'll have, maybe even all year, of how good of an idea it was to sign Patrick Peterson, because the Vikings exclusively played Patrick Peterson last week and will probably continue to do that going forward throughout the season on the right side of the defense, right cornerback position. The Cardinals are essentially the only team in the league that do the same thing on offense. I mean, we did used to see this in the NFL all the time, but now we don't. They put receivers anywhere. But because of, remember Blake's argument that they focus a lot on tempo, because of Kingsbury's offensive identity and their focus on tempo, they keep all the receivers to one side of the formation. So DeAndre Hopkins is the left wide receiver, which means he lines up directly across from where Patrick Peterson would line up. So we'll actually see perhaps even 100% of the snaps, but certainly over 80% of the snaps, Patrick Peterson and DeAndre Hopkins playing each other. So that's going to give us a good idea of who Patrick Peterson is, because we know who DeAndre Hopkins is. The yards that Hopkins gets will be maybe not a direct reflection, right? Because if Peterson's running a low zone and Hopkins gets open deep and beats, like, say, Xavier Woods for a touchdown, that's not on Peterson. But for the most part, these yards will be a direct reflection of Peterson's ability to kind of inhibit him. I'm going to say 60 yards. So the amount below that number, which is technically the question, is about 26 yards.
Let's go to Kevin O'Quigley, who asks, for argument's sake, let's assume Bradbury is not the answer at center. Can Bradbury play tight end? His combine numbers for speed were within 1 to 3 standard deviations of the mean for tight ends, and his strengths in downfield blocking could be an asset.
So I actually looked at his performance versus other tight ends for this question, and I regret it because it would have been way more fun if I didn't. The answer is no. Sorry. If he was a taller center, like if he was like 6'5", you could kind of make some of this work out. Obviously, so at 306 pounds, you can't use what his combine numbers were as direct 1-to-1. But he is like 4th percentile versus tight ends in broad jump, 28th percentile in vertical jump. So that's nice. 18th percentile in 40-yard dash, 15th percentile in three-cone drill. And if you have him lose weight to get to 260, 250, 240, obviously all these numbers will look a lot better. But as a 6'2", or I guess for him it's 6'2", 6'3", really, as a 6'3" tight end, you just kind of have to be fast. You have to do Irv Smith numbers. You have to do Jordan Reed numbers. There's just not that many 6'2" tight ends that are like slow compared to other tight ends. So he is within the range of tight end performances, but because he doesn't have the body type for the kind of performance he put up at the combine, probably not. Maybe he could be a fullback.
Well, he'd probably be more useful than the current situation, but we'll see how the rest of the season plays out. Kenneth Allen asks, how many weeks before the collective NFL media shows up at the new NFL LA HQ with pitchforks and guillotines to demand the All-22?
I don't know that the NFL media typically displays as much of a spine as we would maybe want in that situation. Also, instead, they have just decided to create a black market for All-22. So,
Are they going to have the war against all 22 now?
Probably. I'm excited to see what happens with that.
Developments will be interesting. Also from Kenneth Allen, taking into account their usual level of play, which player is going to disappoint most in this game? My bet is O'Neal going against Watt despite his age.
That one's an interesting one. I would say that this would be normally like an Irv Smith eraser game, so you could maybe put him up, but obviously you can't count him. God, without Eric Kendricks playing, like that's potentially playing. That's Jesus. Let's go with Harrison Smith. He's supposed to provide some help over the top, but with threats like apparently Christian Kirk, as well as DeAndre Hopkins, there are some opportunities for him to get burned.
Next question is going to be from Nick Howard, who asks, what kind of new and unique way do the Vikings lose in this week's game?
Boy, new and unique ways. So I think it could be an obscure, maybe not an obscure, but like kind of a bizarre rule. Like they fumble forward and attempt to pick up the ball in the final 2 minutes of a game, initiating the holy roller rule, and they actually push themselves back as a result of that, or something like that. That could be it. Or they fumble out of the back of an end zone, and while though fumbling out of bounds and anywhere else on an NFL field, returns possession to the offensive team. In this case, it results in a touchback for the other team. So I think that could be it. If they fumble out of the, like on a drive, they're in the red zone and they fumble forward and it fumbles out of the end zone. The other team gets the ball at their own 20. That sounds like an amazing way to lose. Also, they could fumble out of the back of their own end zone and invoke a safety. That would also be a funny way to lose. So I think those three are on my board.
So I saw something on TV last night and I was just amazed by its existence, to the point where I actually went out and had to tweet this out. I was like, I don't understand what just happened here. And so you might have seen me put this out last night, but there was a baseball game that happened last night involving the Baltimore Orioles. And the Baltimore Orioles got their entire groundskeeping staff ejected for chanting at the for chanting at the opposing team, like for being a part of this for being a part of the game, basically.
That rules.
So I just sent you the tweet with the actual video of the team, of everybody leaving. Now the fun thing is, a few minutes later it started to rain. So the people the people out there that would be out making sure that the field is safe they were kicked out of the game, and they had to go in. They had to go in until it was it was raining, so then they could go back out and save the field and everything. But I want to see some version of that happen, and there's only one team that something like that could happen to. Like, this would be worse than the time that it must have been in St. Louis, where a player, like a running back, went to the end zone, went to the sideline, and then like slipped on the lack of turf or whatever, and ended up like tearing an ACL.
Oh wow, yeah, that'd be good.
That had to have happened in St. Louis for some reason. Like, it was a fairly famous player that it happened to. I just cannot place it.
Man, what
was it? Reggie Bush? I don't think it was Reggie Bush.
I mean, that actually does kind of sound right. I'm trying to think of what the Vikings equivalent would be, and okay, so one that could be interesting is maybe the security crew that's like responsible for keeping people off the field or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If they get ejected from the game, and then someone stages like a pipeline protest or something, which did occur 3 years ago.
I think 3 years ago, yeah.
Yeah.
It was Reggie Bush. He slipped on the concrete.
Yeah, the concrete track around the thing. Yeah.
Wow,
so
my brain is
weird.
Yeah, I'm disturbed.
That I think that would be funny, right? If by ejecting the security crew around the field, you like delay your ability to resolve another like protest from the ceiling of the stadium. That sounds pretty Vikings, I think.
Yeah, yes. Nick Howard also asks, we know the NFL is a copycat league. Do the Vikings copy the Niners and Bears and create a package of plays to get Mond some snaps?
To do what? like
maybe to throw the ball more than 8 yards past the line of scrimmage?
Mond famously does not do that. So he's like, I was actually talking to somebody who'd worked with Jimbo Fisher at Florida State, and we were talking about Kellen Mond, and he was like, yeah, so how did Mond look? And I was like, he's kind of like a coward. I was joking, right? But I was like, he kind of is a coward. He doesn't really throw the ball that deep, and based off of what I saw at Texas A&M, good idea. Maybe don't throw the ball deep if you're him. And he goes, yeah, you just kind of get that with Jimbo Fisher quarterbacks. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, right? Because you had EJ Manuel, you had Christian Ponder. I guess not Jameis, just the opposite. But that I don't think would do it, right? Because Justin Fields and Trey Lance have, in addition to their running threat, are first round caliber passers, right? I mean, in theory, right? Like, Trey Lance is a safety, but in theory, they're first round caliber passers. So the defense won't automatically think that you're going to like zone read them or something like that. I don't know that that's a good idea.
Be like, yeah, probably not. Kyle Sleeby asks, which of the current division leaders after tiebreakers will finish the season as the division winner? Dolphins, Raiders, Steelers, Texans, Eagles, Rams, Vikings, Saints.
Yeah, I don't think any of them do. Like when we got this question, I was like, I look at through it and I was like, oh my God. I don't think a single one of those teams wins their division. Holy crap. I mean, like the Dolphins, you could make an argument for it, but I'm pretty confident it's the Bills. Raiders, no chance in hell. Steelers, I think it's the Browns or the Ravens. Texans, no friggin' way. Are you kidding me? No way. Eagles, I think it's the Cowboys. Rams is maybe your best argument. But it's also the best division in the NFL right now. I mean, like I think the top 6 or 8 teams in DVOA, 4 of them are from the NFC West. So anything can happen there. Vikings, obviously not. Saints, it's going to be the Bucks. So, which one of them? If I had to pick an over under, I'd say 1.5. And I think I pick the over just because of the way odds work. But if I had to pick specific ones, I guess I'd only say the Rams, and that's weird.
Bishop Sycamore alumnus asks, as someone out of the market, what is the proper usage of my Sunday ticket? Keeping up to date on our Minnesota Vikings, or hate watching my savior and keeper of my sanity, Rodrigo Blankenship?
I gotta know, like, why he is that? Like, is it because you're local to the Colts, or you're a Georgia fan? Or he's just kind of like a funny NFL character because he's like skinny and wears glasses, and also he's got a hell of a leg? I don't know. I don't know what the answer here is.
I think he might be involved in one of the leagues.
Oh, okay. That makes more sense. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Then watch Rodrigo Blankenship. Why would you watch the Vikings? What are you doing?
Like, watching the kicker is infinitely more interesting.
Yeah, well, especially if you're in our experimental league.
Yes.
He could get you 140 points.
It is possible. Let's go to Damian Barrett, who asks, it was the All-Ireland final last weekend. Irish football Super Bowl for James. Thanks, Damian. Not to Arif, just to me. Thank you.
Damian always does this to you. It's amazing.
And Mayo lost their 10th final since a curse, see link, was put on them in 1951. How does this curse compare to the one the Vikings seem to be under? This is amazing. So
obviously I had to check this out. The link included a second link, which provided a little bit more explanation of the curse. So first of all, it's called the Curse of Mayo. What an awful sounding curse. Second, like the way this curse works is that this Irish team, which I guess is the Hopes of County Mayo is the name of the team. Hopes of County Mayo. Awful name. I guess they've got like crazy good rosters, and they've got these crazy good teams. They've reached the final 10 times since 1951. They haven't made it, right? It sounds extremely Vikings. And I would normally be all in, but then I learned more about the superstition surrounding the curse, and now I can't get behind it. So here's from the link inside the Guardian article, which is another Guardian article. Clutching the Sam Maguire Cup. This is 1951. The young victors piled into a truck and wound their way back to Mayo to celebrate. They were rolling through the village of Foxford when, so legend goes, they passed a church where a funeral was underway. The players did not get out to pay their respects. The enraged priest then uttered the fateful words, "For as long as you all live, Mayo won't win another All-Ireland." And like, God, that seems like way too specific, right?
Yeah, that's way too specific of a situation. Like there's curses, and then there's the clearly fake thing that happened 50 years ago.
Right, yeah. And so what I think probably happened is that 20 years after the fact, they were like, hey, we haven't won since then. And I think it's because we didn't stop. I feel bad personally because we didn't stop at the funeral. And it just kind of like it builds from there, right? Like it starts with a man. I think it's because we didn't stop at the funeral. And then and instead of like just kind of the bad general like juju involved, like the bad vibes essentially of feeling bad about something and just being superstition in general, just evolved into a specific story. And I'm not about that. I think the Cubs curse, right, is way funnier, right, with the goat. That rules, and also like I know that one's true, not because the curse is true. Obviously, that got broken, but because we have historical documentation of like the person cursing them, right? Or like the curse of Babe Ruth, like those rule. This one is weird. I can't get behind it. The less I know about this, the more I can believe in it. And I unfortunately did my research. So I can't get behind it. Does this curse compare to the one the Vikings seem to be under? I feel like if the Vikings angered somebody, it would be like in way funnier circumstances than this. Also, in addition, right? Like I can't imagine what it is. It could be because they were traitors to the AFL, which I guess is not that funny. But like I would hope it would actually be super funny if it was like a real estate, like, you know, the area that Winter Park was originally built on was belonged to somebody else, and they acquired it in a shady business deal. And then like, you know, 60 years later, the Wilfs acquired these real estate barons who, I guess are real estate felons in New Jersey, acquire the team. And so the team can't win unless somebody not involved in real estate owns them.
Yeah, this whole thing just screams of potential problems and weirdness, and it's a fun story. But the idea that it's lasted. How many people are left alive from that original team?
So the wording of the curse is, "For as long as you all live, Mayo won't win another All-Ireland." And there's one person left alive named Paddy Prendergast, super Irish, age 94. So I would imagine that there is the potential for a hardcore Hope of County Mayo fan maybe thinking about homicide.
Yeah, this turned into a tontine pretty quickly.
Yeah, another reason I can't really get behind the curse, because if the way you resolve the curse is a murder, maybe we don't have that curse. That curse isn't part of our history now.
Like, listen,
maybe
if
we
the way
table
that
this
you,
curse.
Yeah, if the way that you lift the curse is through a murder, I'm not sure I can support it. And let's
the murder curses, I'm a little hesitant.
yeah, for whatever reason that one doesn't fly.
I mean, I guess you could wait until he like dies of old age, but I was just like Irish soccer. I mean,
And let's be clear.
And maybe their window is closing, right? Like who knows? Like, is this team going to be this good again? No, this is arguing for the murder. No.
Quit, Arif. Quit arguing for the murder.
It's an instinctive response.
That's a fun sentence to say. And realistically, just looking at that situation, let's remind ourselves what caused the wrath of the priest. What caused the? At this point, you could just refer to them as a wizard if they're if a curse is involved.
Can priests hex people? Is that like a?
I didn't think they could, but here we are.
I don't have like a ton of interaction with Christianity, admittedly. So like, you could tell me a lot of stuff and I'll believe it. But my understanding is that there's not a lot of priest hexing. In fact, they're opposed to hexing.
Quite famously, as a matter of fact, yes.
Right, yeah. So that's I'm poking holes in a curse. I realize that, but like, man, like 15 minutes, man. This curse is not holding up. Also, I think my favorite sentence from these two articles is even skeptics of the curse acknowledge that the Hope of Mayo County is unusually unlucky. Like, yeah, yes, of course. That's the other explanation, right? Like if you're a skeptic of the curse, the other explanation is that they're unlucky. That's it. Yeah, obviously, man.
And what invoked the wrath of the wizard here? Not paying respects to a funeral that you weren't involved in.
I remember like watching, this is way back, so I could get all the details wrong. But my understanding of the curse involving the Cubs is that they didn't take that goat as their mascot, right? I'm not going to look this up. Me not knowing about baseball is part of the bit, so I'm just not going to know about baseball. But I think right? The goat?
I'm not correcting you because...
Okay, cool. Anyway,
it's been too long. This bit has to continue.
Okay, fair. So my understanding is that the Cubs tried to lift the curse by bringing in goats as mascots after the fact, and they even had good seasons when that happened, but that didn't lift the curse. And then even sometimes like goats related to the original goat. Like why? Was it like this guy was like, hey, this goat should be your mascot, and they were like, not really feeling that. That's weird. I know it's 1920, but that's still weird.
All right, now I actually do have to step in here.
Please tell me.
We're gonna go straight.
Did I get the team right? Is it the Cubs and is it a goat?
It is the goat. It is a goat and it is the Cubs.
Okay, fantastic.
If we're gonna be quoting from the Book of Knowledge from Wikipedia, the curse lasted 71 years from 1945 to 2016. During Game 4 of the 1945 World Series at Wrigley Field, a fellow by the name of Cianis, who happened to be the Billy Goat Tavern owner.
I do remember a tavern. Okay, great.
His pet goat named Murphy was bothering other fans, and so the pair were asked to leave the stadium.
Oh, they kicked him out? That's it?
Outrage, Cianis allegedly declared, them Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more, which had been interpreted to mean that the Cubs would never win the National League pennant, at least for the remainder of his life.
Oh, this is why you don't learn about curses. That sucks. Like a broad interpretation, and not even like that's not that funny of a story, except they allowed a goat in the stadium or the field in the first place. That's stupid and funny.
Yes.
But like, he just they're not going to win again. That's clearly a nothing statement. You just said it.
Yeah. So that's what's going on.
That's why I can't learn about curses. They're all dumb. I'd rather learn about baby witches and hexing moons. That's way funnier because the thing you think it is, it's even crazier than that. But with curses, it's like the more you learn, the more the magic, ironically, I guess, gets taken out of
it. you slip behind that veil of believability, and
if there's some documentation of this priest saying exactly that, if like that's confirmed, I'm back on board because that's an insanely specific thing. But it is so specific, I just can't believe that that's what happened.
I mean, speaking of curses and honestly, speaking of curses and conspiracy theories, Avril Lavigne was on MTV a couple days ago, and her name was in quotations.
Shout out to whoever was doing the chyrons.
Yeah,
that's a dude. That's a real dude.
That is, yes, that is fantastic. Enjoyed that thoroughly. Clearly, this is going mainstream. You can't change. You can't run away from this at all, Melissa. People are aware. Ian Polly asks, for the tried and true cooking corner, my wife and I recently moved, quote, forcing me to buy a new grill. I found a new deal on a 36-inch flat-top Blackstone, still have the Weber kettle for real grilling, outside of easy things like breakfast and smash burgers. What do you recommend?
Okay, honestly, the flat top is just best for breakfast. It is elite for breakfast. So outside of that, what do you recommend? Especially if the best outside version is like a smash burger. There's probably not a lot left. I imagine that you might be able to do some interesting things involving sauces and the smokiness of a grill. But, for the most part, I think you kind of nail it with smash burgers and breakfast. James, you probably have a good take on this.
You're basically now in a situation where you've got the flat top and you can use it for just about anything, really, that you could conceive of as far as like, I say like stir fry, but you're in a spot right now where you're just like, oh, let's chop up some onions and toss it on here. Like you're just any excuse to use it right now. I know I was at a kid's birthday party a couple of years ago, and a dad had this that we were at, and he just put a little bit of oil on, tossed some hot dogs on, and just kind of slowly browned them like that, and that was really tasty. So like, there's options. Hot dogs is kind of a weird thing to start with, but it did work pretty well.
You could just grill a hot dog, right, James?
You could, yes. This is basically. Really, Arif? Is that where we're going?
Well, I'm just like the first like specific food item besides an onion that you recommended was something where the Blackstone is completely unnecessary.
Yes, it is fairly unnecessary, but the way that he has his grill situation, it makes it sound like he had to move to an apartment, and it made it sound like they didn't allow charcoal, and so that's just how I'm inferring the logic here. But yeah, just looking at this right now, I mean, hot dogs aside, you could just be in a situation of like, this is like a stir fry thing, chop a bunch of have a bunch of chicken on, have a bunch of vegetables on, and just really utilize the space. You basically have a grill top from like a diner. You could like envision yourself in a diner situation and you have a bunch of people over and like get your whole station together, and then slowly get yourself a drinking problem because now you're behind the now you're getting crushed in dinner rush trying to get all these hamburgers out, and it's not working, and your help is certainly not going to be there and is not doing what they're supposed to. So
James, are you okay?
That's an excellent question. Let's move on to Nolan Kaler, who asks, question for Arif and James dating corner. How does this your dating corner? This has never been your dating corner.
That's right. Yeah, this is one of your corners.
Yeah, this tends to be mine.
Well, it fits the theme of the question, actually. Let's keep going.
I have my first ever double date tonight, and I was wondering
corner.
What tips you, the Don, and it totally crushes the misspelling of this, the Don Quixotes of
Don Quixotes.
Yeah, Quixotes of the Vikings Twitter sphere would have for such an occasion. Should I, for instance, bring 2 wine towels?
Always. Absolutely. Because if you're not bringing an additional wine towel and no one else brings the wine towel, if like your friend who's on the double date with you doesn't bring a wine towel, you're 2 wine towels short. You're 1 wine towel short, and then you're up shit creek. I mean, that you got to bring both wine towels.
It's important to just pack it just in case the other fella involved is unprepared. You have to do this like you would driving in the morning, and you're just making sure that the other guy is like awake, and can actually see you in the morning and is like not going to turn into you. Like, you just have to be a little bit more cautious. Like, okay, I'm just going to make sure, just in case he's not prepared, doesn't understand the etiquette involved in bringing an additional wine towel, I will make sure.
Yeah, and then also a bonus. This is more of like a sort of a backup to a backup to a backup situation, but always be prepared. If you bring an additional wine towel and your friend doesn't, and the double date goes poorly for everybody, you have now asserted dominance over your friend and have now begun planting the seeds of your relationship with whoever your friend brought on the double date. This is like a 1% situation, but always be prepared.
You should always be prepared with a wine towel.
Yeah.
You know,
extra wine towel in this case, but yeah.
Multiple.
Yeah.
Because why not? Andrew Ellis asks our final question of the show and asks, for Arif's beekeeping corner, see, this is yours. What advice would you give to anybody competing on this UK television show, and why are you not a judge? Arif, tell us about Show Me the Honey.
So, well, first of all, it's called Show Me the Honey. Second, it's a British reality show, so it's delightful. And third, dude, just take a look. I mean, it's wholesome, and it involves kids and learning, and it sounds like, I mean, not everyone's a winner, but like everyone's a winner. And that's clearly why I'm not a judge. Are you kidding me? Man, I hate kids. Did we record our pre-show conversation about this?
We did, yes.
Okay. Is that going to be Patreon exclusive, or can we just paste that in here?
That's going to be Patreon exclusive.
Okay. Well, great. Actually, you know what? That's for the best. Honestly, I don't remember what I said, but maybe it wasn't the greatest thing in the world. So
this just flies in the face of your whole like hating kids thing. It's too wholesome.
Yeah, there's no way I could be on the look. Every promotional image of this beekeeping reality show is like cartoonish. Everyone is smiling. The kids are in these like adorable, like colored like pastel colored beekeeping costumes. Oh my God. It's so cute. That's not my scene.
That is most certainly not.
I am in the trenches fighting against the possibility of a bee race war. This is not the part of the beekeeping community that I am like teaching people like useful stuff about beekeeping. No, that's not the part of the community I'm in. So, oh my God, the linked article to this is British apiarists knew it all along. Honey is the bee's knees. What is wrong with the UK? Okay, anyway, I think I've made it very clear why I'm not involved in this reality show. I will be watching it, but I won't be enjoying it.
You have been on the record recently stating that we do take the beekeeping the beekeeping corner an annoying amount of serious.
Yeah, much to my chagrin.
Yeah,
yes.
much to your chagrin. So that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. Reef, what do you have to plug?
Just wrote a piece, pretty happy with it actually, over at The Athletic, about how the Vikings have changed their approach to the defensive line. And it's not just, the players that they have or the fact that they've got a couple of nose tackles when they normally wouldn't, that they have changed the fundamental front and structure of the defensive line and how that might actually help them against the Arizona Cardinals. But yeah, that's over up at The Athletic. We've got every week we're going to have a game preview. Yeah, I mean, those are the most recent things. I've also been on probably a couple of podcasts this week. I can never tell. So yeah, follow me on Twitter at ArifHassan NFL. And I think that's it.
All right. Well, that's going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We will be back next week to hopefully discuss the victory over the Cardinals. But until then, my name is James for Arif. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember, Case Cookus. And we will be back next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's official Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. You can also find his written work at theathletic.com. I am your podcast host and producer, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at BigMono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can make a recurring monthly contribution by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. A donation of $3.50 per month does get you bonus material from the show and much more. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.